The sea has always whispered to those who dared to listen. Long before kings ruled or empires dreamed of glory, it was the wind and the tide that shaped humanity's fate. In the frozen north, men carved their destiny from oak and iron, building ships that could outlast storms and reach beyond the horizon. Each sail that caught the wind was a promise that there was always more to see, more to conquer, more to become. From the misty fjords of Scandinavia to the sunlit harbors of the Mediterranean, the ships of the Middle Ages carried more than men and goods. They carried faith, ambition, and the spirit of discovery that would change the world forever. Every plank, every nail, every gust of wind told the story of human courage, of those who refused to be bound by the edge of their maps. Their sails became symbols of willpower, their journeys, legends that reshaped kingdoms. And through centuries of storms, plague, and war, the sea remained both the test and the teacher of mankind. Tonight, we set sail into that story, through the fog of northern waters and the glittering blue of southern seas, to uncover the evolution of medieval ships, from the fierce longships of the Norsemen to the majestic galleys of Venice and Genoa. This is not just history. It's the tale of how humanity learned to ride the wind and never look back. If the sound of the waves moves you, if the fire of discovery still burns in your chest, then join us. Like the sailors of old, we journey together across time, across tides. So before we hoist the first sail, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Cinematic History, because every voyage deserves a crew. And this story is one worth sailing for. Before the compass, before the empire, there were sails and the will to chase the edge of the world. The first winds of the north carried no mercy. They howled across the fjords, tore through pine forests, and whipped over the dark waters where the world seemed to end. The men who lived beneath those skies learned to endure what others feared. Their homes clung to stone cliffs. Their fires burned low, and their hearts beat to the rhythm of the sea. For them, the ocean was not a path but a presence vast, alive, and hungry. It took as much as it gave, swallowing boats without warning, crushing the weak beneath storms that roared like angry gods. Yet, the Northmen were not content to worship the sea from shore. They studied it, they listened. And in that listening, they found a kind of understanding that would one day change the world. In the beginning, there were only small boats, hollowed logs, crude rafts lashed with rope and hope. But as generations passed, they learned the secrets of balance and weight, of how wood could bend like bone when shaped by flame and frost. They discovered that the keel, a single spine running beneath the hull, could slice through water like a blade. From this, the longship was born, not in the hands of kings or craftsmen, but in the stubborn will of common men who refused to drown. The forests of Scandinavia became their shipyards. Under gray light, men felled oak trees older than their ancestors. The scent of sap and salt mixed in the air as they split the trunks into planks. They shaped each piece with adzes and axes, fitting them together not with nails but with patience, overlapping, curving, alive. When the planks met, they sealed the seams with wool and pine tar, the same tar that blackened their fingers and scented their breath. To the untrained eye, the first longship looked simple, a shallow hull, a raised prow, a single mast. But in its curves lay genius. It could glide up rivers, cross seas, or slide ashore like a serpent. Its hull flexed with the waves instead of fighting them. Its design whispered of instinct, of people who had studied water all their lives. And when they raised the first sail, something ancient stirred. The wind caught the woolen canvas coarse, striped, smelling faintly of sheep and smoke, and the ship leapt forward, silent and smooth. The oars dipped once, twice, then rested. The men stared as the coastline began to drift away. For the first time, they were not rowing towards something. They were being carried. They called the wind by many names, North's Breath, Sea Mother, Sky Hand, but they all meant the same thing: power. For generations, they had feared the storms that crushed their boats. Now they had learned to borrow the storm's strength. The sail turned fear into motion, and motion into destiny. Villages that once lived in isolation began to stir. The sea was no longer a wall, it was a road. One ship became two, then 10. Fathers taught sons to read the horizon, to follow the gulls, to measure wind by the feel on their skin. The ocean was no longer chaos. It was order, written in waves. Still, every voyage was a gamble. There were no maps, no stars charted, no promises of return. The North Sea swallowed men as easily as it carried them. Some ships vanished into the mist, never to be seen again. Others returned weeks later, scarred but triumphant, bearing tales of lands rich with timber and game. And so began the Great Awakening of the North, not through conquest or religion, but through curiosity. In those early days, the ship was more than wood and rope. It was a bond between men and the elements, between courage and consequence. When a storm broke, the crew huddled under firs, eyes wide as thunder rolled across the sea. Lightning flashed, revealing the faces of men who prayed not to gods, but to the mast that groaned above them. And when the tempest passed, they laughed, as if death itself had been fooled once more. No one spoke of glory then. They spoke of survival and of the strange pull that drove them back to sea again and again. A longship was never left to rot. When it grew too old, its bones were burned and its ashes scattered over water. They believed that ships, like men, had souls, and when their purpose was done, they deserved to rest where they had lived. But the Northmen were not a people built for rest. Their ships became extensions of their hunger for trade, for land, for story. A single sail could bring news, gold, or fire. Coastal villages watched the horizon with both hope and dread, for they never knew whether the next ship carried friends or raiders. The sea taught them contradiction, to fear and love the same thing, to pray for calm yet crave the wind. Each voyage tested their skill, but also their belief. Some said that the sea was alive, that it chose who would return and who would not. Others believed it was simply fate, the same fate that froze their crops and cracked their bones in winter. Either way, they accepted it. The sea took its due, always, and still, they built, bigger, faster, bolder, longships that could hold 100 men, hulls that gleamed with pitch, prows carved into snarling dragons to frighten spirits and enemies alike. When these ships left harbor, the sound of their oars was like thunder, a rolling rhythm that echoed through fjords and hearts alike. The North was no longer silent. Its people had found their voice, and it spoke in the language of sails. The horizon was no longer the end of the world. It was an invitation. The sea has never belonged to anyone yet. In the age before kings and borders, there were men who dared to claim it with their bare hands. They did not possess wealth or parchment maps or cities to defend. What they had was the wind and the knowledge that survival in the North was not a gift but a craft. The longship was born from this craft, not from design or decree, but from observation, repetition, and a quiet understanding of nature's rhythm. Each plank and curve was an echo of the world around them, the arch of a whale's rib, the sweep of a gull's wing, the flow of a river bending around stone. These men did not invent ships. They listened to the world until the shape of the sea revealed itself in wood. In every fjord, the shipyards sang with life. The scent of resin and burning pitch hung in the air, thick as incense in a temple. Hammers struck like drums, each beat a hymn to endurance. The blacksmith's forge hissed as iron kissed water, releasing steam like a ghost ascending to the sky. Children carried tools heavier than their arms, their eyes glowing with the light of the flames. Women, with hair tied back against the wind, spun the wool that would soon become sails, their fingers quick and precise, their songs rising and falling with the gusts that howled outside. To the Norse, the act of building a ship was sacred. It was not work, it was worship. When a keel was laid, it was done beneath open sky, never beneath a roof. They believed the sea must see its children born. Offerings were made, bread for strength, beer for courage, and blood, always blood, for luck. A goat's throat was slit across the wood. its life offered to the spirit of the vessel. In those crimson drops, they believed the ship awakened alive, aware, bound to the men who would one day ride the storm with it. The first longships were small, narrow, and light, meant for rivers and fjords. But as the builders' confidence grew, so did the vessels. By the time oak became scarce near the coasts, new forests were being felled deeper inland. Whole communities gathered to drag the logs down snowy slopes, singing to keep rhythm. The sound of their voices carried for miles across the tundra, mingling with the roar of distant waterfalls. When the ship was finally ready, it was named. Always named, never launched without an identity. For to sail without a name was to invite death. They chose names that breathed defiance. Sea Stag, Raven's Wing, Storm, Father, Ruffenblad. Each name carried the promise of return, even if few would keep it. The launching was a moment of awe. The crowd gathered by the water's edge, torches flickering in the wind. The hull, black with tar, rested on greased logs. The chieftain or builder would touch the prow, murmur a blessing to Njord, god of the sea, and then with a cry that pierced the salt air, the ship slid forward, carving a path through sand and foam. The crowd roared. Children laughed. For that brief moment, every soul on shore shared the same heartbeat. And then, as the longship drifted away, the sea swallowed its reflection whole. The first voyages were hesitant, cautious explorations of nearby coasts. The sailors hugged the shorelines, sleeping under woolen cloaks, lighting driftwood fires on pebble beaches. They learned by failure, by grounding their hulls on hidden rocks, by patching holes with leather and tar, by watching how the wind bent the surface of the water. Slowly, their maps were drawn not on parchment, but in memory, passed from one crew to the next. But curiosity, once fed, becomes hunger. Soon, they pushed farther across fjords, through straits, out into the open sea. They discovered that a well-built longship could outrun a storm if steered with courage, or hide from one if beached on time. They learned to read clouds as warnings, to watch how whales migrated, to follow flocks of birds returning to unseen lands. One night, when the aurora blazed like green fire across the sky, a sailor pointed at the shimmering waves and said, "The gods are showing us the way." No one laughed. They believed it. In a world without compasses, faith was their only navigation. And so, faith guided them farther than fear ever could. The sea became their teacher. Each wave whispered a lesson. Each storm demanded a price. Some never returned their names carved on wooden markers, their widows lighting candles in hollow stones. Yet every loss only deepened the Northmen's resolve. The sea takes what it wants, they said, but it always leaves a path for the brave. The design of the longship evolved in rhythm with that bravery. The hulls grew longer, the sails broader. The clinker-built technique, overlapping planks bound by iron rivets, made the ships both flexible and strong, bending with the water instead of resisting it. The prow was raised into a dragon's head or serpent's snarl, not just for beauty but to frighten spirits said to dwell beneath the waves. When these ships cut through the mist, they looked alive beasts of wood and wind, gliding silently toward destiny. At first, they carried only small crews, hunters, traders, wanderers, but soon the longship became the instrument of something greater, the will of a people who had outgrown their frozen homeland. The same vessels that once carried furs and fish began to carry warriors clad in iron. Their shields gleamed in the dawn. Their voices rose in unison as they rowed toward unknown shores. The Northmen's mastery of the sea transformed them from survivors to seekers. Their ships could sail upstream, where no army could march. They could strike swiftly and vanish before the enemy's alarm bells rang. To distant kingdoms, it must have seemed as though the sea itself had given birth to them, wild, merciless, unstoppable. But beyond the raids and legends, there was something deeper in their journeys, something unspoken. The longship became a mirror of the soul. The men who built them were men who could not rest, farmers who left their frozen fields, fishermen who chased the horizon, sons who dreamed of seeing what their fathers could not. Each voyage was both escape and return, a way of seeking meaning in a world that offered none freely. At night, when the wind fell still and the water lay black as obsidian, the crew would rest on deck beneath the stars. They did not speak. The silence between them was not emptiness, but kinship, the bond of those who had faced the same abyss and dared it to swallow them. Somewhere, a single wave would break, and all eyes would turn toward the sound. Even in calm, the sea never truly slept. The Northmen learned that the ocean was not just distance, it was memory. It held echoes of every ship that had ever crossed it, every life lost to its hunger. And when the wind shifted, it seemed to carry those voices back to shore, a reminder that glory and grief were forever entwined. In time, stories of the longships spread beyond the north. Traders from the Frankish coast spoke of sails like wolf pelts, of ships that moved faster than the tide. Monks in Ireland wrote trembling in candlelight of dragons that came from the sea. And while fear traveled faster than truth, one thing was certain: the north had awakened. But those who looked upon the longship and saw only war misunderstood its essence. To the Norse, it was not just a weapon. It was freedom carved, tarred, and bound with iron. Freedom to move, to seek, to change. Freedom to become something greater than what the land allowed. When a ship was too old to sail, it was not abandoned. It was honored. Some were buried with their captains, the hull filled with weapons, gold, even horses, then set aflame and pushed into the sea, a funeral for both man and vessel, a journey for both spirit and ship. Fire met water, and for a brief, blazing moment, earth, sea, and sky were one. The people of the north believed that every ship carried not just men, but the will of the gods. When the prow cut through the surf, it was as if the divine itself guided the way. To them, destiny was not found on land. It drifted out there, where sky met sea, where courage met chaos. And so, the longship sailed on, from one shore to another, from mist to storm. It became the thread that stitched together the scattered tribes of the north. The wind became their blood, the sea their heart. The world beyond was no longer unreachable, it was waiting. One day, they would follow the rivers into the heart of Europe. One day, their sails would be seen on the coasts of England and France. One day, their children would stand beneath foreign suns and speak of home in a tongue the world had never heard. But all of that was yet to come. For now, the Northmen stood upon their rocky shores, watching the horizon burn with the light of dawn. The sea stretched before them, endless and alive. And in that silence between waves, they felt the pulse of history quicken. It was not the land that would define them, but the wind. And with each rising tide, that wind whispered the same promise. The world is wide, and it waits for those who dare to sail it. The sea that once cradled the Northmen had become their battlefield. From quiet fjords and wind-torn cliffs, longships now launched not for trade or exploration, but for conquest. The same sails that once whispered of survival now thundered with intent. The wind, once a companion, had become an accomplice. In the chill of early dawn, hundreds of ships gathered along the coastlines of the north. Their sails, dyed red and black, caught the first light of morning and bled it across the water. The sound of hammers and shouts echoed between the granite walls of the fjords. Warriors sharpened their axes on stone, tightened the leather of their belts, and marked their faces with ash and blood. Ravens wheeled above, black wings cutting against a pale sky, as if the gods themselves were circling to watch. To outsiders, it might have seemed madness. Why leave home for war when the sea itself already tested every life it touched? But for the Northmen, this was the natural order. Life was short, harsh, and uncertain. Honor was the only permanence, and it could not be earned by waiting on the shore. The ship was not merely transport, it was fate, carved in oak and tar. To die at sea was not tragedy. It was destiny fulfilled. The longship was the perfect instrument for their hunger. Fast, silent, and agile, it moved where armies could not. With a shallow draft, it glided up rivers unseen, striking deep into the hearts of foreign kingdoms. At full speed, its oars beat like the wings of a bird, each stroke carrying men who believed they were chosen by the gods of war. When a fleet of longships approached, the horizon darkened, as if night had come early. The raids began small. Isolated monasteries on the coasts of Britain and Ireland, places of prayer and peace, became their first targets. The monks who once heard only the sound of gulls and bells now heard the thunder of oars, the clash of steel, the cry of men who came not for worship but for wealth. Gold chalices, silver crosses, and jeweled manuscripts were stripped from altars. Fire consumed the wooden halls, smoke spiraling into the heavens like dark prayers. The word Viking spread like fire across Europe, whispered first in fear, then shouted in rage, finally spoken with awe. To the people of the south, it meant both invader and omen. Villages were left in ashes, rivers ran red, and yet, from those same flames, new connections were born. For with every raid came trade, and with trade came knowledge. The Northmen were not mindless savages. They were observers, learners. Each shore they touched offered something to bring home: stronger iron, finer cloth, new tools, strange gods. What began as plunder soon turned to commerce. Markets rose where monasteries once stood. The sea, ever impartial, carried both war and wealth with the same tide. Yet even among their fiercest raids, there was order, a code, as ancient as the sea itself. The crews followed their captains not out of fear but loyalty. Each man shared in the risk, each man shared in the reward. When they landed on foreign shores, they did so as equals, bound by blood oath. The ship was their brotherhood, and the sea, their silent witness. Legends began to form. Songs told of chieftains whose names carried the weight of storms, men like Ragnar Lodbrok, whose cunning and courage turned the tide of kingdoms. His ships, it was said, moved with the wind's own will. He raided not only for gold, but for glory, to etch his name upon the memory of men. They said that when Ragnar's fleet sailed, the horizon itself trembled. His longship, the Drakkar, bore a dragon's head of iron and teeth carved from whalebone. Its eyes, filled with pitch, gleamed in the sun as though alive. The prow sliced through fog and fear alike, its reflection dancing like flame upon the sea. But Ragnar was not alone. Across the north, other sea lords rose, each with their own ambition, each with their own gods to please. Some sought power through blood, others through trade. Some returned home with silver enough to fill their halls. Others never returned at all. The sea gave and took in equal measure. When fleets set out, their families gathered on the cliffs, wrapped in furs, faces pale beneath the cold light. They watched the sails disappear into mist, praying to Freyr for good winds and safe return. Many of those prayers were answered only by silence. Months later, wreckage would wash ashore, pieces of hulls, shields, and bones polished smooth by the tide. Still, they built again. Always, they built again. For in the north, grief was no reason to stop. It was reason to continue. The raids changed more than the world they struck. They changed the raiders themselves. Villages became towns. Warriors became merchants. Seafarers became settlers. Some who went to raid never came back, not because they perished, but because they stayed. They built homes on foreign shores, married local women, and planted roots in strange soil. Their language mixed with others, their children spoke in new tongues. The sea, once the border of their world, had become its bridge. From England to Normandy, from Ireland to the Baltic, Norse blood seeped into the veins of Europe. Kingdoms rose upon their wake, their influence woven into laws, names, and legends that would outlive their sails. Yet the sea remained their truest throne. The captains of the north were not crowned by men, but by waves. Their courts were decks slick with salt, their crowns the wind that tangled their hair. They ruled not by decree, but by courage, the kind that faced storms with laughter and met death with song. In the heart of every Viking expedition lay a paradox: destruction and creation bound together, The same hands that burned abbeys also built towns. The same ships that brought terror also brought trade. Civilization advanced upon the same current that carried conquest. And through it all, the longship remained unchanged, timeless, perfect in form and purpose. Whether cutting through battle or bearing cargo, it was the symbol of man's unyielding desire to master what could never be owned. As seasons turned, the North grew rich. Silver flowed into its markets. Stories of distant lands filled its halls. The once isolated fjords became gateways to the world. But wealth brought rivalry, and rivalry brought war. Neighbor turned against neighbor, clan against clan. The sea, once their unifier, became the stage for civil blood. Still, even in their feuds, the ships endured. They fought upon the same waters that had once carried them to glory, their sails torn but proud. Each battle was both tragedy and tribute to the gods, to the sea, to the legacy of the windborn. And when the storms returned each winter, sweeping snow across the mountains and freezing the harbors, the Northmen waited, sharpening blades, mending sails, dreaming of spring. They knew that as long as the tide still turned, there would always be another voyage, another chance to chase the horizon. In the flicker of their hearth fires, they saw the shimmer of sunlight on water. In the crackle of wood, they heard the echo of waves. The sea was in them now, not just in their craft, but in their blood. It had made them raiders. It would soon make them rulers. For from the ashes of villages and the wealth of foreign lands, the Northmen were becoming something new, not just wanderers of the sea, but its lords. And the world, though it burned, was beginning to listen. By the time the first frost of another century touched the shores of the north, the raiders had become kings. What began as a tide of violence had settled into rhythm, not peace, but something older, steadier, and more enduring. The sea had taught them everything: patience, precision, and above all, permanence. Empires on land would rise and crumble, but the ocean never forgot the names of those who mastered it. The Vikings had learned to be more than destroyers. They had become rulers of the tide itself. Where once they struck and vanished, now they stayed. Along river mouths and sheltered bays, wooden fortresses rose, ringed with stone walls, and watchtowers carved with dragon heads. Markets bloomed beside them, the smell of salt and smoke mingling with spices and fish. Ships no longer came home empty. They carried not only loot but goods from every corner of the known world. Silks from Byzantium, silver from Francia, amber from the Baltic, wine from the south. The Northmen, who had once taken by axe, now traded by weight. Yet beneath every handshake lay the same calloused hands that once held blades. Each port became a kingdom of its own, a realm ruled not by crown or cathedral, but by the sea. The chieftains who commanded fleets now called themselves sea lords. Their power measured not in acres but in oars. Their banners flew from the prows of ships rather than castle walls. Theirs was a dominion that could not be besieged, for it moved with the wind. Among them, few shone brighter than Ragnar Lodbrok. His legend, carried by skalds and sailors alike, became the heartbeat of an age. Some said he was born from Odin's blood, others that he was forged by the sea itself. Whatever the truth, his name struck fear and fascination across the continent. Ragnar understood what few before him had, that the sea was not only a weapon, but a world. He sailed to lands beyond maps, to the English kingdoms, to Francia, to the isles where monks prayed to gods who did not answer. When diplomacy failed, he sent fire. When fire failed, he sent his voice. Many rulers would rather pay tribute than test the wrath of a man whose ships could appear at dawn and vanish by dusk. But even Ragnar knew, the sea bows to no one for long. The tides that lifted kings could drown them just as easily. Rival sea lords rose against him, men whose ambition matched his courage. Fleets clashed upon the same waters that had once carried them to glory. Shields locked, arrows hissed, and the sea drank deeply of red. Some battles were fought for gold, others for pride, but all were fought for the same prize: mastery of the waves. The north became a realm of water and wood, its people bound not by land but by route. News traveled by sail, Alliances were made by oar. A single shipwreck could end a dynasty. A single storm could crown a new one. And yet, amid all the blood and fire, something remarkable began to grow, a civilization carried by the tide. The same ports that once echoed with the clash of axes now rang with the chatter of markets. Traders haggled in half a dozen tongues, and shipwrights shared secrets once guarded by clan and craft. The Norse learned from the south, adopting coinage, writing, and trade laws. They built towns not only for defense but for exchange. From Hedeby to Birka, Kaupang to Ribe, harbors became living hearts of commerce, pulsing with life day and night. Ships from across Europe came to anchor in their waters, bearing spices, salt, wool, and wine. A man could walk through the market and hear Latin from a monk, Greek from a merchant, and Old Norse from a dozen tongues of home. But even as prosperity rose, the Northmen never forgot their origin. In the great halls of the sea lords, shields still hung above the hearth, and the songs of the skalds still praised the courage of those who died with salt on their skin. Children were raised with the same tales of the longship, not as myth, but as inheritance. They were a people born from the wind. And yet, the more they learned of the world, the more the world began to change them. The Norse who settled in foreign lands adopted new gods, new laws, and new loyalties. In England, they built Danelaw, a kingdom within a kingdom. In Normandy, their descendants would one day speak French, but still rule with the sea's ferocity. In Ireland and Scotland, they founded towns that would outlast their tribes. The line between raider and ruler blurred, until no one could tell where conquest ended and civilization began. The sea, as always, was both cradle and judge. Winter after winter, fleets still set out not to burn, but to build. They carried timber and iron, priests and poets, gold and slaves. Every voyage changed them, reshaping the North from wilderness into network. The longship became more than a symbol of war. It became a vessel of culture. Still, some old instincts refused to die. There were nights when the winds howled through the harbors, and the old warriors felt the pull of the horizon once more. They would stand at the docks, cloaks whipping in the storm, eyes fixed on the dark water. To them, peace was only the space between voyages. The sea was calling, always calling, and though their ships now bore merchants instead of soldiers, that call still whispered of glory. The younger generation heard it differently. They saw the sea not as a battleground, but as opportunity. They dreamed not of burning villages, but of trading empires. The longship's bloodline would live on through them in the merchant fleets of the Hanseatic League, in the carracks of the Renaissance, in every sail that rose to meet a new horizon. For the Vikings had taught Europe the oldest truth of all, that the ocean does not divide, it connects. Through them, the seas of the north became the arteries of a continent. The flow of goods, ideas, and ambition carried forward a new age. Where longships once prowled, now larger vessels followed, each tracing the wake of their ancestors. In the sagas that would be written long after, poets would speak of Ragnar and his sons, of kings who ruled both land and tide. But beneath the legend lay a deeper story, not of men, but of movement, of how humanity learned that the world was not a prison, but a passage. And as the century turned, a new wind began to stir. The same ingenuity that had built longships now sought to refine them. The sails grew larger, the hulls broader, the cargo deeper. Iron replaced bone, rope replaced sinew. The age of raiders was fading, and in its place rose the age of merchants. Yet if one stood upon the cliffs of the north and looked to the horizon, the sight remained the same. The glimmer of sunlight on the sea, the silhouette of a sail, the endless promise of elsewhere. The Northmen had conquered what no sword could ever claim, the will of the wind. And though kingdoms would fall and borders shift, the echo of their oars would remain, beating softly beneath every voyage that followed. The sea, once feared, had become their inheritance. It whispered their legacy in every wave that touched another shore. And as the tides turned, carrying their descendants southward, toward warmer waters, new coasts, and distant dreams, the world itself began to move with them. The age of raiders had given birth to something far greater. The dawn of the sailors who would bind continents, who would trade not only gold but destiny. The North had unleashed the sea upon the world, and the world would never again be still. The world the Vikings had carved with axe and sail was changing. The sound of war drums had faded, replaced by the softer rhythm of commerce, the creak of ropes, the splash of anchors, the murmur of bargaining voices echoing across wooden piers. What had once been a world of raiders had become a world of merchants, and the wind, ever faithful, carried a new kind of ambition across the northern seas. The same fjords that had launched longships now launched merchant cogs, where dragons once cut through the mist. Square sails now billowed with grain, iron, and amber. The North had learned that wealth could conquer what blades could not. The ports of the Baltic thrived like living organisms. At dawn, the harbors of Lübeck, Visby, and Bergen glimmered with frost. Their wooden warehouses packed tight with goods from every corner of Europe. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries mingling with the clang of hammers and the laughter of dockworkers hauling barrels onto decks slick with dew. The air was heavy with tar, salt, and the scent of smoked fish, the perfume of a new empire. Ships now bore the marks of collaboration. German, Danish, Swedish, and Dutch builders worked side by side, refining the cog, a stout vessel with a single large sail, high sides, and room enough for cargo and crew alike. It lacked the sleek elegance of the longship, but it was built for endurance, not speed. Its hull could carry the weight of a kingdom's economy, its mast a flag of peace instead of conquest. The sea that once divided now connected. Across the cold waters of the Baltic and North Sea, alliances formed. Merchants began to speak of brotherhood, of trust forged not by oath but by trade. Out of this new tide rose the Hanseatic League, not an empire of land or crown, but of wind and will. It was an idea as bold as any conquest, that cities, not kings, could rule the seas through cooperation, that prosperity could flow like the tide, touching all who sailed upon it. From the warehouses of Lübeck to the markets of Novgorod, from London's wharves to Bruges canals, the League bound the North in invisible threads of commerce. Ships moved not in fleets of war, but in convoys of protection, merchantmen guarded by watchful eyes, and the unspoken law that to attack one Hanseatic vessel was to challenge them all. The League's seal, a ship beneath a rising sun, became a promise of safe passage, of trade routes free from the chaos of petty kings. For the first time in centuries, the northern seas grew calm. But calm does not mean stillness. The men who sailed these waters were not so different from their ancestors. They still watched the horizon with the same hunger, still felt the pull of the wind like a calling. Only now, their treasure was not gold, but connection. Each voyage was a bridge between worlds, the fisherman's net linking to the weaver's loom, the iron miner's sweat turning into the merchant's coin. The ports themselves became mirrors of this transformation. Lübeck, the shining heart of the League, stood like a cathedral of commerce. Its streets, once muddy tracks, were paved with stone. Its harbors lined with cranes and warehouses taller than any longhouse. The sound of the tide mingled with the chant of merchants counting in Latin, Low Saxon, and Norse. Bells rang to mark the tides as much as the hours. Farther east, Visby rose like a jewel of the Baltic, its walls high and white, its gates carved with the symbols of ships and saints. Within its markets, traders sold wool from England, furs from Finland, and honey from the Russian forests. Even the poorest fisherman could find himself speaking with men from lands he would never see. The sea had given birth to a new kind of power, one not built on conquest, but cooperation. And yet, the soul of the sea remained untamed. Every sailor who raised a sail knew that fortune could shift with a single gust. Storms came without warning, smashing ships like toys. Pirates, remnants of the old world, still prowled the coastlines, their sails black and hungry. And though the League promised protection, no law could bind the ocean itself. The wind gave, and the wind took. But still they sailed. For every ship that sank, 10 more were built. For every storm that scattered a fleet, another fleet would gather. Stronger, wiser, more determined. The sea tested them as it had always done, and the merchants of the north learned to read its moods like scripture. They developed new tools, compasses from the east, sturdier ropes, stronger hulls, and their maps grew richer with each voyage. What once had been white voids of uncertainty now bore names. Skagerrak, Kattegat, Öresund. The unknown was shrinking, and with it, the fear. Trade winds became the new heartbeat of Europe. From these northern waters, prosperity flowed southward to Flanders, to France, to the Italian states that waited beyond. Each harbor became a note in a growing symphony of commerce, each sail a verse in humanity's oldest song, movement. The age of the longship had been one of muscle and blood. The age of the cog was one of mind and hand. Both, however, were born from the same source, the sea's relentless invitation to move, to dare, to build. On certain mornings, when the fog hung low over the harbors, the shape of a merchant cog in the distance could easily be mistaken for an ancient longship. Its single sail, catching the pale sun, might have seemed the ghost of an era gone by, a whisper from the time when men sailed not for profit, but for pride. Yet perhaps the difference was never as great as it seemed, for in the heart of every sailor, whether warrior or trader, the same fire burned, the yearning to go beyond. And in that, nothing had changed. As the century turned, the League reached its height. Its influence stretched from the Arctic Circle to the English Channel. Princes sought its favor, and kings feared its wealth. The sea had become a throne again, only now its monarchs wore merchants' robes. But the North, for all its newfound order, could not hold its breath forever. Change was coming once more. The same winds that filled the sails of trade would one day carry explorers farther than any Viking had dared dream. The same ports that built the League would send forth ships that would find new worlds. For history, like the sea, never truly rests. It only changes direction. And as the gulls cried over the harbors of Lübeck and Bergen, and the sails turned south toward warmer tides, a new current stirred beneath the waves, one that would carry Europe beyond its own horizon. The age of trade had begun, but the winds that drove it would soon awaken something far greater. By the time the Hanseatic League had bound the cold waters of the north in its invisible net of trade, another sea was stirring, warmer, older, and no less restless. The Mediterranean. If the Baltic was the cradle of endurance, the Mediterranean was the cradle of civilization. Its waves had seen the rise and fall of empires, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, and now watched as new powers unfurled their banners upon its blue expanse. In its harbors, sails gleamed like mirrors in the sun, and the air was thick with salt, spice, and the promise of fortune. For centuries, the merchants of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa had ruled these waters. Their galleys cut across the sea like knives of light, long, narrow, driven by both sail and oar. Each stroke of the rowers was a heartbeat of empire. Where the cogs of the north rolled steadily with the wind, the galleys of the south moved with precision and intent, guided by the rhythm of muscle and command. When the winds of trade began to blow from the north, the two worlds met not in battle, but in exchange. The cogs of the Hanseatic League sailed south through the Channel, past Flanders and the Bay of Biscay, down into the Iberian ports, where Moorish merchants traded silk and sugar. From there, they slipped into the straits, the narrow throat of Gibraltar, and entered waters as ancient as myth. The meeting of North and South was not a clash, but a convergence. The men of the North brought strength, timber, and discipline. The men of the South brought art, mathematics, and memory. In the shipyards of Venice, craftsmen studied the northern hulls, the broad-bellied cogs that carried immense cargo through storm and ice. They saw in them endurance, the ability to face long voyages without fear of capsizing. And in the harbors of Lübeck and Hamburg, shipwrights whispered of the southern lateen sails, triangular, elegant, capable of catching the gentlest breeze from any direction. Ideas crossed the sea faster than ships. The next generation of vessels bore the marks of both. The North learned grace. The South learned strength. The marriage of the two gave birth to something new, the first carracks, the giants of the late medieval world, whose sails reached for the sky like cathedrals of cloth. The sea, once a divider, had become a bridge not only for trade, but for knowledge. In the ports of Venice, merchants spoke the tongue of the League. In Bergen, sailors told stories of the sunlit markets of Genoa. Goods no longer traveled alone with them, came ideas, art, and faith. The cross of Christianity, the science of navigation, the art of map-making all flowed along these tides. The age of trade winds was not merely about wealth, it was about awakening. And yet, beneath the shimmering surface of prosperity, the old tension of the sea remained. For the ocean gives, but it does not forgive. Storms swept the Mediterranean as fiercely as they did the north. Entire convoys were swallowed between Sicily and Crete, their cargoes lost to coral and current. Piracy, too, evolved. The corsairs of Barbary watched from their rocky coasts, their black sails rising like shadows against the golden horizon. Every voyage was still a gamble, every sunrise a test of resolve. But those who survived became legends. The merchants of Venice built their wealth upon daring. Their ships sailed to Alexandria, to Constantinople, to the gates of the Holy Land. They carried glass and perfume, silk and silver, stories and sin alike. On deck, beneath the hot sun, sailors told tales of ghosts from the north, ships with square sails of wool, captains who navigated by stars rather than faith. And in the taverns of Lübeck, sailors told of the south of marble cities that floated on water, of markets that glittered like treasure chests, of women whose veils smelled of cinnamon and honey. The sea connected them all, weaving their myths into one shared story, humanity's endless conversation with the wind. As decades passed, this conversation deepened. Navigation became science. Trade became diplomacy. And the ship, once the symbol of war and survival, became the vessel of civilization itself. In monasteries, scholars began to map the seas with greater precision. The stars, once seen as the eyes of gods, became guides for man. Instruments like the astrolabe and quadrant replaced instinct with calculation. The world was no longer guessed, it was measured. Still, for all their charts and compasses, sailors remained humble before the waves. A captain might know the stars, but the sea always had the final word. The spirit of the longship had not died. It had simply evolved. In every mast that creaked, in every hull that groaned, its legacy lived on. The Norse had taught the world that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The Venetians taught that beauty and order could tame chaos. Together, they forged an unspoken alliance, a harmony between motion and meaning. In Venice, the arsenal hummed like a living creature, thousands of craftsmen laboring in rhythm, building ships faster than any fleet before. The sound of their hammers echoed across the lagoon, each strike a heartbeat of the Republic's ambition. In Lübeck, the bells of street Marys tolled above the docks, their notes mingling with the groan of rigging and the splash of waves. Merchants lifted their eyes to the sky, watching the gulls wheel in the wind, and wondered how far a man could go if he simply kept following the tide. And somewhere, between north and south, a new kind of dream was forming, the dream of sailing not just to trade or to conquer, but to discover. For as the trade winds carried ships farther and faster than ever before, whispers began to spread in every harbor, whispers of lands beyond the sunset, of islands untouched by Rome or Christendom, of worlds waiting beyond the edge of the map. The sea, once known, was becoming unknown again. And the same wind that had once filled the sails of Viking raiders and Venetian galleys now stirred with something ancient and familiar, the call to go farther. Before the compass had guided explorers, it had guided merchants. Before it guided merchants, it had guided raiders. And before all of them, it had guided dreamers. The tide was turning once more. The merchants of the north and the sailors of the south had built an empire not of land, but of motion, a civilization bound by water. But history does not rest. The same ships that carried silk and salt would soon carry something far heavier: destiny. For in the distance, beyond the straits and stars, the horizon shimmered with the faintest promise of another world. And the wind, that eternal architect of history, was already changing direction. Dawn rose over Venice like a slow-burning flame. The first light of morning spilled across the lagoon, gilding the domes, the masts, and the mirrored surface of the water. Bells echoed from distant towers, their chimes carried by the same wind that stirred the city's countless banners. Beneath that light, the arsenal awoke. No other place in Europe moved like it. The Venetian arsenal was not a shipyard, it was a heartbeat. Within its stone walls, thousands of craftsmen worked in perfect rhythm. The hammer of the smith, the saw of the carpenter, the hiss of pitch-ceiling hulls, each sound layered upon the next, until the city itself seemed to breathe. Timber from Dalmatia, iron from Tuscany, hemp from Crete, everything converged here, transformed into ships that would carry the Republic's will across the sea. The Venetians called the arsenal Il Cuore del Mare, the heart of the sea, and in every sense it was. Rows of half-built galleys stretched like skeletons under the morning sunday. Oars lay stacked beside them, smooth as polished bone. Men shouted orders in the dialect of the lagoon, their words drowned by the rhythmic pounding of mallets. The smell of salt and resin clung to the air. Within a single day, a galley could rise from raw timber to ready vessel. Venice had turned shipbuilding into an art and an empire. For the Mediterranean was not conquered by armies, it was conquered by merchants. The Venetians had inherited a sea as old as civilization itself, but they ruled it with modern precision. Their ships were longer, sleeker, faster, a fusion of form and function. A Venetian galley carried not only cargo, but the spirit of the Republic, disciplined, calculating, endlessly ambitious. At sunrise, the fleet assembled. Dozens of galleys rocked gently at anchor, their sails furled, their crews ready. Captains moved down the decks inspecting every rope, every oarlock. The decks gleamed with oil and sweat. When the command was given, the first drumbeat sounded deep, resonant, eternal. Then the oars dipped in unison, and the sea shuddered with life. Each galley rode like a creature of muscle and wood. At the bow, the lateen sail unfurled, catching the faintest breeze. The vessel surged forward, sunlight flashing on bronze rams and painted shields. Beneath, the water churned into white foam, leaving behind a trail as straight as a blade's edge. From above, it looked like choreography, the sea transformed into stage and orchestra alike. The Venetians did not merely travel, they performed dominion. But Venice was not alone. To the west, Genoa stirred proud, wealthy, and hungry. Its harbor, a crescent of stone and sail, glittered beneath the same Sunday. Genoese shipwrights built with a different philosophy, their galleys heavier, their hulls fortified, their hearts tuned to battle as much as trade. Where Venice sought harmony, Genoa sought victory. Between the two cities stretched not land, but rivalry, a rivalry that spanned generations and seas. Their flags met on every horizon, in the Aegean, the Adriatic, the Black Sea, even the narrow straits of the Levant. Where one raised a market, the other built a fortress. Where one signed a treaty, the other sharpened its knives. The Mediterranean became a chessboard of marble and wind. The pieces were ships. The stakes were destiny. Still, beneath all ambition lay the same truth. Mastery of the sea required not only wealth, but understanding. The mariners of Venice and Genoa were scholars of the wind. They studied its moods, its shifts, its strange silences. The lateen sail, triangular, agile, elegant, was their instrument. With it, they could sail close to the wind, turning even resistance into motion. It was an art born of patience and mathematics, and the men who practiced it moved their ships with a grace that seemed almost divine. Every voyage south toward Alexandria or east toward Constantinople was a lesson. The sea taught geometry. The stars taught humility. At night, when the galleys anchored in quiet coves, sailors lay upon their decks, staring at constellations that had guided men since Babylon. They named them not in Latin or Greek, but in their own tongue: Stella del Mare, Cuore del Vento. The sea had many languages, and they spoke them all. Trade and war blurred together. Convoys carried spices and silk beneath banners of peace. Yet every ship bore hidden crossbows and iron-tipped spears. Pirates prowled the coastlines. Ottoman corsairs tested the courage of every captain who dared the Levant. The Mediterranean demanded vigilance. To rule its waters was to live in perpetual balance between risk and reward, faith and calculation. In the piazzas of Venice, merchants whispered prices while diplomats whispered secrets. Every ledger could become a treaty, every voyage a gamble with nations. Gold weighed as heavily as gunpowder. Still, it was beauty that defined the South. Where the northern seas inspired endurance, the Mediterranean inspired expression. Ships became floating, artworks painted prows, gilded figureheads, sails dyed crimson and blue. Even war galleys gleamed beneath the sun, their elegance masking their ferocity. To a Venetian, the perfection of design was itself an offering to God. And so, each voyage began not with prayer, but with pride. As the fleets of Venice and Genoa spread eastward, they carried more than cargo. They carried culture, architecture, art, philosophy, the rebirth of ideas long buried beneath the ashes of Rome. The sea once more became a highway of rebirth. Through trade with Byzantium and the Arab world, knowledge flowed back into Europe. The mathematics of navigation, the medical sciences of the East, the astronomy of the ancients. These gifts arrived not in libraries, but in the holds of ships. The Mediterranean was the Renaissance before the Renaissance. At the height of its power, Venice was a world unto itself, a city that floated, dreamed, and ruled upon water. Its wealth gleamed in gold mosaics and mirrored palaces, but its soul was still wooden, tarred, and carved from the forests of the north. Each galley was both tool and testament, proof that mastery of the sea was mastery of destiny. And far below, where sunlight turned green through the water, the old world slept. The wrecks of Roman triremes, Byzantine dromons, and Viking cogs rested side by side upon the seafloor, silent witnesses to humanity's unending pursuit of motion. For in every age, men built ships not to escape the sea, but to belong to it. And as the wind rose once more, sweeping across the white-tipped waves, it carried the scent of new ambition of cities that would soon look beyond the pillars of Hercules, past the edge of every charted map. The masters of the Mediterranean had claimed their sea. Soon, they would claim the world beyond it. By the time the bells of Venice had rung 1,000 dawns, the city no longer sailed alone. Across the sea, Genoa had grown into her mirror, equal in ambition, opposite in soul. Where Venice moved like a dancer, precise and deliberate, Genoa struck like a soldier. Both cities were born of salt and wind. Both believed the sea loved them most. Their rivalry became the rhythm of the Mediterranean. Each year their fleets met, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as enemies. The horizon itself seemed to shimmer with tension. Two armadas of galleys, their banners rippling red and gold against the Sunday. When peace held, they divided the sea between them with invisible lines, each claiming ports and markets as kingdoms claim soil. When war returned, those same lines dissolved into foam. The Mediterranean remembered every clash. In 1284, off the Ligurian coast near Maloria, the water turned black with pitch and blood. The galleys of Pisa burned first, their decks collapsing under showers of flaming arrows. Venetian observers wrote that the sea itself seemed on fire, the reflection of the flames stretching from horizon to horizon. Genoa emerged victorious that day, but victories on the water never lasted. The tide had no allegiance. For every triumph, a storm waited. For every empire, a reef. Yet through their feuds, the cities of the sea unknowingly built each other's greatness. Competition forced innovation. The Venetian galley grew lighter, faster, armed with swivel catapults and reinforced rams. The Genoese hull deepened, its ribs stronger, its decks broader to bear the new bronze cannons that thundered like gods of the deep. Shipwrights on both sides experimented endlessly, mixing the high forecastle of the north with the sleek southern hull, merging the northern square sail with the Latine triangle. Out of rivalry came the first hybrid vessels, ships that could survive both calm and storm, speed and siege. The Mediterranean had become a laboratory of power. When the call of the Crusades echoed from the west, both Venice and Genoa answered not for faith alone, but for opportunity. Armies needed transport, cities needed contracts, and the merchants of the sea were always ready to serve whatever god paid best. From the quays of Venice, entire fleets departed toward the Holy Land, ships brimming with soldiers, priests, horses, and relics. The drums of war beat in the same rhythm that once drove the oars of trade. In the holds lay crosses of gold and barrels of wine. On deck, banners painted with saints fluttered beside shields, still warm from the forge. For a moment, the sea itself seemed to march. The Crusades turned the Mediterranean into the center of the world. Venetian and Genoese galleys ferried kings, crusaders, and pilgrims eastward. They returned laden with silks, spices, and stories that would ignite Europe's imagination. Alexandria, Acre, and Constantinople became words of power ports, where East met West, where Greek fire and Frankish steel shared the same horizon. It was not faith that truly conquered, but commerce. When the Fourth Crusade turned its fury not upon Jerusalem, but upon Constantinople, it was Venetian ships that carried the flames. The ancient capital of Byzantium, glittering, eternal, fell beneath banners of street mark. Gold and relics filled Venetian holds. The spoils of empire became the foundations of marble palaces along the Grand Canal. Even in ruin, the sea rewarded those who served it. Yet victory bred arrogance, and arrogance drew envy. Genoa rose again, challenging Venice in every port. Their agents dueled in markets and monasteries alike, in silk prices, in alliances, in whispered promises to kings. Every treaty signed in one harbor was broken in another. Their struggles stretched from the Levant to the Strait of Gibraltar, from the Aegean to the Atlantic's edge. To rule the Mediterranean was to play a game against time itself. But time favored those who adapted. Venice learned diplomacy as deftly as it had learned navigation. Where swords failed, silver succeeded. Ambassadors replaced admirals. The Republic built an empire of agreements, small colonies, loyal ports, quiet profits. Genoa, weary of constant war, turned westward, investing its wealth in Spain and Portugal. There, its bankers would one day fund new kinds of voyages. Voyages not across the Mediterranean, but beyond it. For the sea was changing again. The invention of the magnetic compass and the refinement of navigational charts transformed possibility. No longer did sailors cling to the coasts. They began to trust the open water. The wind, once feared for its caprice, became a guide. In the Latine sails of Venetian galleys and the square sails of northern cogs, a synthesis had emerged, the blueprint of the future. From these hulls and masts would grow the carrack and, later, the caravel ships destined to cross oceans no map yet dared name. But before the new age could dawn, the old one burned brighter than ever. The 15th century was the Mediterranean's golden dusk. Venice stood at its zenith, its markets overflowing with pepper and pearls, its mosaics glittering beneath candlelight. Genoa's merchants counted their fortunes in the shadow of marble cathedrals. In Florence, painters mixed lapis with gold dust to capture the shimmer of the sea. Everywhere, water and wealth were the same word. Yet beneath the surface, currents of change stirred. The Ottoman Turks pressed westward, tightening their grip on the eastern routes. The price of spice climbed with every battle lost. The sea that had made Europe rich now hemmed it in, as if reminding its masters that even freedom has borders. In the taverns of Venice, sailors whispered of a different route, a path around Africa, a way to reach the Indies without bowing to the Sultan's tolls. Old mariners traced invisible circles on tavern tables, describing winds no one had yet ridden. Young apprentices listened, eyes wide, the firelight reflecting dreams of endless blue. The Mediterranean, though still magnificent, had begun to feel small. But in that narrowing lay perfection, for the South had given the world its art of balance between beauty and strength, commerce and courage, land and sea. Every future voyage, every ocean crossing that would follow, owed something to the galleys that once ruled this inland sea. As the sun sank beyond the Adriatic, painting the water red and gold, the silhouettes of ships drifted across the horizon, oars poised, sails furled, awaiting the evening wind. The bells of street marks tolled again, echoing across the waves to distant Genoa. Their rivalry had forged an era. Their craft had forged a world. And though storms would come and empires fall, the mastery they achieved would endure not in marble, but in motion. For even now, every ship that sails under the evening star still carries a whisper of their legacy, the art of turning wind into will, and the endless promise of the sea. The 13th century dawned beneath a crimson sky. Across the harbors of Christendom, bells tolled in uneasy harmony, from the spires of London to the domes of Venice. Their echoes rolled across the water like a summons. The age of faith had set its sails. For centuries the sea had been a corridor of trade, of silver and silk, of quiet ambition measured in coin. Now it became a corridor of zeal. The same winds that once carried merchants toward profit would carry armies toward salvation. In every port, shipyards roared, hammers struck as if forging penance. The scent of pitch and sweat mingled with incense from chapel altars nearby. Priests blessed the keels before they touched the tide, sprinkling holy water over oak darkened by tar. Carpenters crossed themselves before driving each final nail. Faith had entered the timbers. The fleets that took shape were unlike any seen before, half war machine, half pilgrimage. The long, lean galleys of the Mediterranean were refitted for crusade. Hulls sheathed in iron plates, decks widened to bear horses and siege engines. From the north came heavier cogs, their square sails dyed with the red cross of Christendom. When these two traditions met, a new breed of vessel emerged, broad of beam, sharp of prow, a floating cathedral bristling with arms. On the morning of departure, harbors filled with sound, the bleat of oxen, the creak of wagons bearing supplies, the low chant of monks pacing the quays. Trumpets blared from citadel walls. Sailcloths snapped against the wind like the wings of angels impatient to ascend. Families knelt on the stones to say farewell. Few would meet again. When the tide turned, anchors lifted, and the sea became a moving congregation. To the men aboard, each voyage was more than war. It was judgment. The horizon was heaven's gate, the waves its test. They believed that to die at sea in the service of the cross was to wash one's soul clean and soft. Even the most hardened mercenary whispered a prayer before the first storm. The routes eastward threaded through waters thick with memory. Past Sicily, past Cyprus, the fleets followed paths once sailed by Greeks and Romans. At night, the helmsmen steered by constellations that bore both pagan and Christian names. God wrote the heavens for our guidance, the priest said. And the sailors nodded, though their eyes read the stars as their fathers had by habit, not by scripture. As they neared the Levant, the color of the sea changed, from northern gray to deep sapphire, from familiar to foreign. Heat shimmered off the decks, armor burned to the touch. The wind smelled of sand and spice. Across the horizon rose the towers of Acre, glittering like a mirage. There, faith and fortune collided. The harbor of Acre was a forest of masts. Venetian and Genoese galleys jostled beside English cogs and French transports. Each nation's banner fluttered like prayer flags in the desert wind. The noise was endless, bells, orders, arguments in a dozen tongues. Here, the sea that had once divided Europe now united it beneath a single cause. But unity, like calm weather, never lasted long. Rivalries smoldered beneath the piety. Venice and Genoa eyed each other across the quays, their captains smiling through clenched teeth. Each sought not only God's favor, but monopoly on the eastern trade routes the crusade would reopen. Gold glimmered beneath every hallelujah. The fleets that carried soldiers to the Holy Land returned laden with spices, ivory, and knowledge. Faith went east, profit came west. Between psalms and ledgers, a new world took shape. The crusader ships themselves became floating contradictions. On the upper decks, priests led mass beside the masts. Below, slaves turned the oars. On the forecastle, knights sharpened swords while shipwrights patched leaks with wax and rope. War and worship breathed the same air. When tempest struck, and they always did, the division between holy and human vanished. All hands bailed together, cursing and praying in equal measure. Some nights the storms were so fierce that the horizon disappeared. The sea turned black as ink. Lightning split the heavens like divine wrath. In those moments, even the most devout realized how small faith felt against the wind. Yet when the morning came, and the sun bled gold through ragged clouds, they thanked God or perhaps the sea for sparing them. Each crusade left behind more wrecks than victories. The seafloor became a graveyard of zeal. Hulls splintered by coral, anchors tangled in seaweed, relics scattered among bones. But history does not count the drowned. It counts the changed. And Europe was changing. From the contact between East and West came new wonders. Sailors returned with stories of latticed towers, of glass that shone like captured sunlight, of charts drawn with precision unseen in Christendom. They brought back astrolabes and Arabic numerals, ideas as potent as any treasure. The faith that had sent them forth returned as knowledge. In the shipyards, that knowledge took form. Engineers began to measure rather than guess. Hulls curved according to ratio, not ritual. Rudders shifted from side to stern, granting a captain finer control. The sea, once guided by instinct, now bent to mathematics. Even the sails spoke of synthesis. The northern square for power, the southern Latin for grace. Together, they formed a cross against the sky geometry turned theology. Through these hybrid ships, the world's horizons expanded. Fleets that once stopped at Acre now pressed farther, trading with Alexandria, touching the ports of Arabia, daring the Red Sea itself. The Holy Land became a waypoint, not an ending. Faith had built bridges where conquest could not. Back in Europe, the cities of the sea grew richer than their kings. Venetian merchants wore rings set with gems from Damascus. Genoese bankers financed cathedrals with profits from spice. Churches rose whose frescoes shimmered with the dust of faraway deserts. Even the language of sailors changed words from Arabic and Greek, slipping into every dialect of the coast. The crosswinds of faith carried more than salvation. They carried culture. Yet beneath all glory lingered exhaustion. The wars never truly ended, only shifted shape. Each generation built larger ships, raised higher banners, sang louder hymns, yet the sea remained impartial. It had seen gods before, and it would see them fade. Still, the men of that age believed utterly. They believed the ocean itself was holy water stretched across the earth, a baptism for the brave. And perhaps, in a way, they were right, for every voyage purified the limits of human fear. By the time the last Crusader fleet limped home, Europe was no longer the same. Its maps were fuller, its coffers heavier, its faith more complicated. The wind had taught it both devotion and doubt. And in that space between belief and reason, a new kind of power began to grow. The power to explore for discovery's sake, not redemption's. The sea, once the servant of God, was becoming the partner of man. When the last Crusader banners faded from the walls of Acre, the wind did not fall silent. It turned westward, carrying home the ghosts of a century of holy wars and the seeds of something entirely new. Across the Mediterranean, ships returned scarred but wiser. Their hulls were patched with timbers from every port between Marseille and Jaffa. Their crews spoke a dozen tongues and prayed to half as many gods. They had left as soldiers of Christ. They came back as citizens of the sea. The Mediterranean that awaited them was not the same. The old dream of conquest had withered, but in its place grew curiosity, a quieter, stronger faith in human craft. The shipbuilders of Venice and Genoa no longer carved prows for saints. They carved them for speed. In the arsenals, carpenters replaced hymns with measurements, priests gave way to mathematicians, and superstition began to share its bench with reason. The church still blessed each keel, but now the blessing was ceremony, not necessity. Salvation had shifted from heaven to horizon. The fleets that once bore knights now bore merchants, scholars, and mapmakers. From Alexandria came papyrus and astronomy. From Damascus, instruments of glass and brass. Captains learned to read the stars through an astrolabe, to chart their latitude by the shadow of the Sunday. They no longer waited for divine signs, they calculated them. Faith had built the bridge. Knowledge would cross it. In the halls of Venice's arsenal, masters spoke of the divine geometry of the hull. Every curve obeyed proportion. Every mast followed rule. The sea, they said, rewarded symmetry as much as prayer. The new ships that glided from the slips seemed almost alive, broader beamed than galleys, higher sided than cogs, with sails both square and triangular, the best of north and south. They could cross open water for weeks without sight of land. The builders named them carracks, the heirs of every voyage that had come before. And with them, Europe prepared to breathe again. The men who sailed these ships were children of two worlds. They had grown up in cathedrals, but were baptized by storms. They still carried relics in their packs, but beside them lay compasses. Each voyage was both pilgrimage and experiment, each harbor a lesson. When they looked upon the horizon, they saw not heaven's edge, but opportunities. From this fusion of faith and calculation emerged the first true navigators, not crusaders, not conquerors, but seekers. They sailed farther than pilgrims had dared. Following currents that slipped beneath the known map, they traced the African coast, learned the pattern of trade winds, and discovered that the world itself seemed to breathe. The wind that had once carried prayers now carried plans. Back in Europe, power shifted. The kings of Portugal and Spain, once minor players in the theater of crusade, listened to the sea's new language. They saw in it not penance but profit. Genoese bankers financed expeditions. Venetian pilots trained Iberian crews. The Mediterranean's knowledge spilled into the Atlantic like wine from an overturned cup. But the heart of it, the pulse, still beat in the inland sea. Every innovation that would one day send ships around the world had first whispered through these waters. The compass, the lateen sail, the stern rudder, the dream of reaching God by finding his creation's edges. The Crusaders had sought the Holy Land. Their descendants sought the whole earth. And still the contradictions endured. Faith built cathedrals from Crusader gold. Yet the same faith sent inquisitors to chain the minds that questioned it. The sea, impartial as ever, carried both light and shadow. It ferried relics and heretics alike. Storms continued to remind men of their limits. Each time a fleet vanished in the Aegean or the Tyrrhenian, the survivors told the same story, that when the thunder rolled and the mast snapped, no saint could help them, only skill. Slowly, reverence turned practical. The sailor's prayer became shorter. Let the wind hold. By the 14th century, Europe's maps had changed color. What had been void now gleamed with coastlines and islands newly named. The seas of crusade had become the seas of commerce. Yet, in every chart's corner, an artist still drew angels blowing wind from their trumpets, as if unable to let go of the old belief that heaven moved the tide. The ports reflected the same paradox. In Venice, incense drifted through street. Marks while, outside, merchants bargained over pepper and pearls. In Barcelona, monks illuminated manuscripts describing the creation of the world, while shipwrights outside built the vessels that would soon test its circumference. Faith and curiosity shared the same streets, their voices indistinguishable from the cries of gulls. Through it all, the Mediterranean glowed not with the fire of crusade, but with the shimmer of Enlightenment's first dawn. The light on the water seemed different now, softer, wider, infinite. Sailors began to sense that the world's horizon curved. The notion was heresy to some, liberation to others. Either way, it changed everything. Every tide carried rumor. In taverns, Men spoke of strange currents far out in the western sea that seemed to pull ships south and west before turning them home again. God's breath, some called it. Others, the circle of the world. No one yet knew its name. But the pattern of those winds would one day lead beyond all known shores. The church tried to reclaim the narrative. Priests preached that exploration was still a form of devotion, that to measure creation was to glorify its creator. But the tone had shifted. The sailor no longer waited for miracles. He made them with his own hands. By the century's end, the Crusader cross still fluttered on many sails, yet its meaning had changed. It was no longer a sign of holy war, but of heritage, a reminder of the generations who had steered by faith before science gave them stars of their own. On quiet nights, when the Mediterranean lay calm as glass, captains would sometimes look down from the quarterdeck and see the reflection of their sails upon the water. The red cross shimmered there, doubled, one in heaven, one in the sea. Between them stretched the thin line of the horizon, neither wholly divine nor wholly human. It was in that space that the future waited. The crosswinds that once carried crusaders east now blew west, toward promise. The old routes to Jerusalem would soon give way to new ones toward India, Africa, and lands unimagined. The ships themselves would change names, but their spirit would not. They were still cathedrals of motion, still sanctuaries of courage. Faith had not vanished. It had evolved. It no longer asked men to die for heaven, but to discover it. And the sea, ageless and indifferent, welcomed them, all believer and skeptic, merchant and mariner, with the same open hand. When the night deepened and the wind turned cold, the sailors whispered a prayer older than any creed. Keep us steady. Keep us true. They did not know it, but that whisper marked the end of the Middle Ages. Beyond the Straits of Gibraltar, the Atlantic waited, vast, unseen, and silent. Soon the descendants of crusaders would steer into it, chasing a horizon no scripture described. And the faith that once built ships to reach Jerusalem would build ships to reach the edge of the world. The sea that had once carried faith and fortune turned traitor. Its winds still blew. Its waves still glittered beneath the sun. But something unseen rode upon them, something that breathed no air and feared no storm. It began quietly, as all catastrophes do. A few ships limped into the harbors of Messina, their sails ragged, their decks strangely silent. The dockworkers waited for the usual shouts, the clatter of cargo, the laughter of sailors drunk with relief at landfall. None came. When the first ropes were cast ashore, no hands caught them. The vessels drifted like ghosts until they struck the piers. Then the smell spread. The harbor masters climbed aboard and found what the gulls already knew. Men blackened by fever, rats crawling through spilled grain, silence thick enough to choke a prayer. Within hours, the alarm bells tolled. Within days, they rang everywhere. The plague had come by sea. For 1,000 years, the oceans had been Europe's veins, pulsing with life goods, ideas, courage. Now those same arteries carried death. Every ship that entered a port brought news of another city fallen. From Messina to Genoa, from Marseille to Venice, the black tide rolled on, silent and absolute. Sailors tried to flee it, but the sea betrayed them. The wind that filled their sails also filled their lungs. The same ropes that tied them to life tied them to contagion. No prayer could hold back the invisible tide. Venice was the first to understand. The city that had built its glory on trade was now a trap of its own making. The narrow canals that once echoed with song turned into corridors of echoing bells. Barges carried not spices and silk, but the dead stacked beneath linen, ferried out to islands that became cemeteries. The lagoon itself seemed to sicken, its waters darkening as if mourning its people. The Republic answered with discipline. They built wooden huts on the outlying islets, 40 giorni, 40 days of isolation for every ship that arrived. The word quarantine was born from that desperation. Even in terror, the Venetians found a way to order the chaos. Yet the measures came too late for many. Whole fleets lay abandoned at anchor, their masts swaying like grave markers. Elsewhere, panic ruled. In Marseille, sailors set fire to their own ships rather than let them rot in port. In Genoa, harbors closed beneath crossbow guard, yet the plague slipped through anyway, hidden in the fur of a single rat. Along the coast of England and Flanders, fishermen dragged empty nets and watched the sea itself grow quiet, as though even the fish had fled. Trade collapsed. The Hanseatic cogs of the north sat idle, their holds full of unsold grain. The great Mediterranean galleys that had once bristled with color and pride now rotted at their moorings. In every port, the smell of tar and salt gave way to the stench of decay. The sea was still beautiful, but its beauty had become cruel. For generations, sailors had believed the ocean purified. Now it infected. They whispered of cursed winds, of demons hiding in the spray. Some captains ordered their crews to sail westward into open water, hoping to outdistance death. None succeeded. The tide followed. And yet, amid despair, the discipline of the sea endured. The pilots kept their logs. The helmsmen kept their watch. Even as the plague devoured cities, shipwrights recorded the details of hull and mast, as if the act of remembering could hold back oblivion. "We build still," one Venetian wrote, "for when this sickness ends, the sea will remain." It did. When spring returned, the survivors emerged to find the world changed. Empty docks creaked in the wind. Towns that had once echoed with market cries now murmured only with waves. In that silence, Europe seemed to hear the sea for the first time not as servant, but as mirror. The water reflected their fragility. The black tide had spared no rank. Merchants and fishermen, priests and princes, all met the same horizon. But it had also left gifts no one expected. The survivors inherited spaceland, tools, and opportunity. Labor grew valuable. Invention became necessity. In the years that followed, shipyards reopened not to mourn, but to rebuild stronger. From grief rose progress. The new ships that slid into the water were broader, cleaner, better balanced. The builders washed their hulls with vinegar, fumigated their holds with herbs, and painted eyes on the prows to see evil before it comes. Superstition and science mingled like salt and fresh water, inseparable. In Venice, the quarantines evolved into hospitals. Record-keeping became law. In Genoa, navigators charted not only winds but weeks of disease, learning that isolation could control fate. The very concept of maritime health had been born from catastrophe, but memory lingered. At dusk, when the harbor bells tolled for evening prayer, those who lived through the plague swore they could still hear the echoes of the death bells within them. A second heartbeat, faint but permanent. Out on the open sea, the sailors felt it too. The sunset no longer promised return. It promised remembrance. They spoke less, worked more, and treated each voyage as confession. Yet the sea forgave. It always did. Its tides erased the traces of every burning ship, every mass grave. In time, the waters turned blue again, and gulls returned to the masts. Life, stubborn as the tide, rose where despair had sunk. And with life came ambition once more. Europe, purified by suffering, looked outward. The merchants who survived the plague were harder, hungrier. They had seen the worst the world could offer, and found themselves unbroken. To them, distance no longer meant danger. It meant freedom. The sea had taken half of humanity, and given the other half the courage to go anywhere. The years after the plague felt like an endless winter. The air itself seemed thinned by grief. Bells no longer tolled for the dead. There were too few hands left to ring them. Across the coasts of Europe, ports lay still, their cranes sagging, their ropes rotting in the rain. Wind swept through empty warehouses, stirring dust where once had been the scent of wine, fish, and tar. The sea whispered, patient as ever, waiting for man to return. He did, slowly. At first it was the fishermen. The poorest always go back first. They patched their nets with trembling fingers, pushed their small boats into the gray surf, and prayed that the sea would forget what it had carried. It did not, but it gave them fish. That was enough. Hunger, not hope, rebuilt the world. Then came the traders, cautious as ghosts. The old trade routes reopened one harbor at a time. From Bruges to Barcelona, captains raised patched sails on ships that still bore the stains of sickness. Their cargoes were small: salt, wool, wine, but their voyages meant more than gold. They were proof that life continued. Every port, though haunted, began to heal. In Venice, grass had grown between the stones of the piazza. Now footsteps returned. In Genoa, the shipyards rang again with hammer blows. The first sound of carpentry after silence was like birdsong after a storm. Shipbuilders, hardened by loss, built differently now. They widened the decks, deepened the holds, raised the sides higher against the waves. The new ships seemed solemn, almost mournful, their hulls painted black not for beauty but remembrance. They sailed under the same sun but cast longer shadows. And yet, within those shadows, innovation stirred. The plague had wiped out not only people but old hierarchies. Wealth and skill had scattered into new hands. Apprentices became masters overnight. Merchants' sons learned to steer their own ships. The world, emptied, had room again for change. From that emptiness, the Renaissance began not in palaces or libraries, but in harbors. The sailors who returned to sea were not the same as those who had left it. They had stared at death and found it unremarkable. What terrified their fathers only intrigued them. When they saw a storm on the horizon, they did not turn back. They studied its color. When they heard tales of lands beyond sight, they did not laugh. They listened. The plague had stripped them of illusion, leaving only curiosity. The sea responded. Its winds grew steady, its seasons predictable once more. After years of chaos, the climate calmed, as if even the elements had grown weary of mourning. The sailors took it as a sign. Shipyards flourished again. In Venice, masters of the arsenal experimented with new forms, blending the old galleys of the south with the broad cogs of the north. They studied how the hull flexed in storm, how the wind caught a triangular sail differently from a square one. Mathematics replaced guesswork. Geometry replaced prayer. Out of this fusion rose the caravel's ancestor, smaller than a carrack, faster than a cog, made for endurance rather than battle. The craftsmen worked as though driven by memory. "We build for those who were lost," they said, carving small crosses inside the ribs of each new hull. To sail again was not only commerce, it was penance. When the first fleets set out after the plague, their departure drew crowds. People lined the quays in silence, not cheering, not praying, simply watching. The sight of a ship under full sail had become something sacred. Every mast that rose above the harbor was a monument to survival. The seas, too, seemed changed. Travelers wrote of strange clarity of waters in which they could see their reflections perfectly. "It is as though the world has been washed," one chronicler said, "and we are the residue." The black tide had cleansed more than bodies. It had scoured the mind. Across Europe, thinkers began to question the old boundaries of the world. If pestilence could come from nowhere, perhaps knowledge could as well. Fear turned outward, becoming wonder. In Florence and Genoa, artists painted ships as symbols of the soul, fragile, resilient, forever searching for harbor. Poets called the sea God's mirror. Even the church, once wary of curiosity, began to bless exploration as divine study. The boundary between faith and reason blurred again, softer this time, like the line between sea and sky at dusk. Trade returned with a vengeance. Grain moved north, wool moved south, gold flowed in every direction. The Hanseatic merchants reclaimed their routes through the Baltic, while the Venetians extended theirs to the Levant once more. Yet profit was no longer enough. The survivors wanted meaning. They sought not only to rebuild the world, but to understand it. The sailors who had seen entire cities vanish no longer feared the edges of maps. They trusted in wind and wood more than in walls and kings. When they gathered at night on the decks, beneath stars that looked down indifferent as ever, they spoke of finding the limits of God's creation or proving that it had none. In the dark below deck, rats still scurried through the grain, reminders of the horror that had once come from the same corners. But the sailors did not hate them. "They live as we do," one old pilot said. They carry the world on their backs. The phrase spread among crews, half jest, half prayer. To carry the world, that was the new creed. By the middle of the century, Europe's ports had been reborn. Venice's bells rang not for death but departure. In Lisbon and Cadiz, new shipyards rose where plague pits had once been. From them came the first true carracks, towering, three-masted giants with high castles, fore and aft, capable of carrying men across oceans rather than coasts. The sea that had once been Europe's grave had become its path to resurrection. Still, no one forgot. The sailors painted symbols on their sails, eyes to ward off sickness, circles to honor the sun, skulls to mock the plague. Their ships carried both fear and defiance like twin figureheads. On calm nights, when the moon shone white on the water, they swore they could see shadows moving beneath the waves, the shapes of ships lost to the black tide, sailing forever in silence below. No one spoke of it aloud, but every man felt it, that the sea remembers everything. And so, out of remembrance came mastery. The same ocean that had once punished mankind now yielded its secrets. Currents were charted, winds recorded. The patterns of the world began to take shape, and Europe prepared, unknowingly, for discovery. When the first dawn of the new century broke, the harbors no longer smelled of death. They smelled again of life, tar, salt, fish, smoke, and ambition. The sails that filled the horizon no longer looked like funeral shrouds. They looked like wings. The black tide had receded, but what it left behind was more powerful than any empire. The certainty that the sea could destroy and yet be survived. And from that certainty came the courage to seek beyond its farthest line, to chase not death, but destiny. The sea had taken its tithe of death, and in return it gave inspiration. Out of the silence that followed the plague came a new sound, the creak of timber, the flutter of canvas, the hum of thought. Europe's gaze, once fixed upon heaven, turned back to the horizon. Everywhere, men began to build again, not merely ships, but dreams. In Lisbon, the dawn shimmered across a harbor alive with construction. Carpenters' saws hissed through oak from the black forest. Smiths hammered bolts that glowed like miniature suns. The scent of pitch hung thick in the air, blending with salt and oranges from the nearby markets. The song of work had returned. They called it a renaissance, a rebirth. But it was not born in palaces of marble or halls of art. It was born in shipyards. For the Renaissance began not with paint or parchment, but with wood, rope, and wind. The men who built the new ships were neither saints nor scholars. They were artisans, descendants of plague survivors and crusader sailors. Their hands calloused and eyes unblinking against the glare of the sea, they carried the knowledge of 100 generations of builders, the Norse for strength, the Venetians for grace, the Genoese for endurance. Every plank they set, every line they tied, was a bridge between ages. And the ships they created were unlike any that had come before. The caravel was small, swift, and strong, its triangular lateen sails drinking the wind from every direction, its hull curving smooth as a shell. It could dance with storms that would have broken the old cogs in half. It was not born for war or worship, but for discovery. Beside it rose the carrack, the grand cathedral of this new maritime faith, towering above the water, 3 or 4 masts crowning its deck. It carried entire worlds within its ribs, merchants, scholars, priests, and soldiers, all sharing the same voyage. The carrack was civilization adrift, a microcosm of Europe's rebirth, carved in oak and sealed with tar. The Renaissance of sails was as much a transformation of the mind as of the hull. The sea was no longer a border. It was a book. Every current, every tide, every constellation was a line of scripture waiting to be read. In Florence, Leonardo da Vinci sketched hulls and propellers in notebooks stained with salt. In Venice, cartographers painted the world's edges with serpents and angels, their maps equal parts science and myth. In Portugal, scholars gathered under candlelight to study the winds, the invisible architecture of the planet. They discovered patterns older than nations, the trade winds spiraling across the equator, the westerlies whispering toward home. To master them was to master destiny. And so the age of exploration began not with a single voyage, but with an awakening, a collective realization that the horizon was not the end of the world, but its beginning. From the Atlantic to the Adriatic, captains dreamed of routes untraveled. They traced their fingers across maps, imagining coasts unseen and riches unclaimed. For the first time in memory, ambition no longer felt like sin. It felt like purpose. The church blessed these ventures as acts of faith, to discover the fullness of God's creation. The merchants blessed them as investments. The sailors blessed them simply as escape. Whatever their reason, all shared the same wind. It carried them farther than any generation before. In Lisbon, Prince Henry gathered shipwrights, astronomers, and cartographers under one roof, a brotherhood of knowledge. His school of saggers became a lighthouse for the mind. There, Arab navigational secrets met Norse endurance, and mathematics met mythology. From those discussions came compasses more precise, astrolabes more accurate, and maps that bent the world toward truth. Soon the sea was alive again with movement. Caravels darted along the African coast, their sails flashing white against the blue. Galleons from Venice and Genoa ventured past Crete toward Alexandria and beyond. The Hanseatic cogs once again loaded amber and grain, carrying them to southern ports, now hungry for life. The world hummed with the rhythm of discovery. It was a rhythm of optimism. The sailors who set out no longer feared the edge of the map. They sought it. They were artists of motion, painting trails upon water. Each voyage was a brushstroke upon the canvas of the earth. And yet, even in triumph, the memory of the black tide remained. Every port still bore silent monuments, statues of sailors lost, shrines of stone weathered by spray. The survivors carried that memory within them, shaping their courage into something humble. They did not believe they could conquer the sea. They believed they could learn from it. This humility gave birth to mastery. At dusk, when the harbor quieted, the new sailors watched the sun melt into the horizon, its reflection stretching like fire across the waves. They spoke of the sea as artists spoke of light, changeable, infinite, divine. The Renaissance on land found its mirror on the water. While painters explored perspective, navigators explored direction. Both sought the same thing: truth through motion. In the great libraries of the era, scholars drew parallels between exploration and salvation. Man's journey upon the waters, one Venetian theologian wrote, is the body's echo of the soul's voyage toward knowledge. To sail was to think. And so they did further, faster, freer. New harbors were founded along strange coasts. The sails that once bore crosses now bore crests of families, guilds, and nations. The age of sail had become the age of self. Every voyage told the story of humanity's hunger to know itself by what it could endure. From the decks of those ships, the world no longer seemed infinite. It seemed inviting. The stars that once inspired fear became familiar friends. Mariners named them as if baptizing the sky: Polaris, Vega, Altair. The heavens themselves became a map. Back home, the sea's rhythm infused everything: music that swelled like wind, architecture that curved like hulls, art that shimmered like sunlight on water. The same hands that stitched sails carved marble and mixed pigments. The Renaissance was not a place. It was a tide that touched everything. And through it all, the sea remained both teacher and test. It forgave nothing, rewarded courage, punished arrogance, and offered beauty without promise. The men of this new age understood that bargain and accepted it willingly. The sails they raised were no longer banners of war or symbols of faith. They were declarations of wonder. And as the 15th century dawned over Europe, the horizon blazed with the color of ambition, red and gold and white, the hues of new nations and older dreams. The ports that had once fallen silent during the black tide now roared again with life, their bells ringing not in mourning but in hope. The sea was no longer the enemy of man. It had become his greatest mirror, vast, untamed, and full of possibility. The 15th century opened like a sail, unfurling slow, bright, unstoppable. Everywhere, the wind of renewal blew through Europe's harbors. In the same decades that Michelangelo sketched the human form, and Brunelleschi raised domes toward the sky, shipwrights shaped wood into curves just as divine. Art and navigation had become twin expressions of one truth. The world could be understood through beauty. To stand in a Renaissance shipyard was to witness creation itself. In Venice's arsenal, builders moved like a single organism, each motion feeding the next. Sparks leapt from anvils, light catching in the smoke like the halo of a saint. The rhythmic pound of mallets formed a music older than language, the pulse of civilization returning to life. 100 ships rose together from scaffolds of oak and iron, their ribs arching toward heaven like the vaults of cathedrals. The craftsmen no longer built blindly. They built with geometry. Angles were measured by compass, arcs by proportion. The shipwright became a mathematician, his blueprints echoing the harmony of Pythagoras as much as the vision of Da Vinci. Each vessel carried within it the same balance the artist sought on land, the marriage of strength and grace, of structure and soul. The ships were not simply tools. They were the embodiment of an idea that man could move through the world with purpose rather than fear. And the world began to move with him. The Mediterranean, once the center of everything, now hummed with a new restlessness. It was no longer enough to sail from Venice to Alexandria or from Lisbon to London. The horizon had grown too small for such ambitions. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient edge of the known world stretched the open Atlantic, vast and glittering, calling like a god's whisper. The sailors of the Renaissance listened. In Portugal, they gathered under the flag of a prince whose faith was as fierce as his curiosity, Henry, called the Navigator. His charts covered the walls of Sagres. His instruments lined the tables where astronomers and mariners argued by candlelight. He demanded precision, not prophecy. Under his gaze, sailors learned to read the sea like scripture, the stars like punctuation. Their ships' caravels with fine lateen sails and clean, curved keels slipped along Africa's coast farther than any European had ever dared. They mapped each inlet and cape, recording the behavior of the winds, the taste of the currents. In their logbooks, poetry and calculation shared the same page. "The sea bends around the world," one wrote. "It has no edge, only return." Back north, the merchants of the Hanseatic League studied these reports with envy. The Baltic, once a kingdom of trade, now felt like a pond compared to the oceanic stage awakening to the west. Yet even they contributed. Their sturdy cogs became models for the supply ships of exploration. From every corner of Europe, experience flowed together into a single tide of knowledge. Navigation became the new art. The compass needle, trembling but sure, replaced divine omen. The quadrant and astrolabe measured what had once been mystery. The sailors no longer prayed for direction. They calculated it. And yet, in every voyage, faith still lingered not in the church's sense, but in something deeper. Belief in the sea's fairness, in man's endurance, in the idea that creation itself invited discovery. Every journey began with ceremony. Before departure, priests sprinkled holy water on the decks, and captains offered a final coin to the waves, an old pagan gesture the church pretended not to see. When the anchor rose and the sails filled, the onlookers felt they were witnessing resurrection. The sea had once brought death. Now it brought destiny. From the high castles of Carracks, Europe looked outward. The decks were crowded not with warriors, but with mapmakers, merchants, linguists, and dreamers. The voyages became floating laboratories. Every object mattered: the curve of a hull, the pattern of a cloud, the rhythm of a current. Discovery was no longer conquest, it was observation. To those aboard, the world itself seemed to be awakening. As they sailed farther south, the stars changed. Familiar constellations dipped below the horizon, and new ones rose strange, brilliant, uncharted. The sailors watched them in awe. "God has written his secrets in the sky," one navigator murmured, "and we are learning to read." The Renaissance of sails was a marriage of humility and daring. The mariner bowed to the elements even as he measured them. He could not command the wind, but he could understand it. Each voyage, each chart, Each experiment was a conversation with creation, a dialogue of courage and curiosity. Back on land, the spirit of navigation seeped into everything. Artists painted horizons that curved like oceans. Architects built domes shaped like the sky. Music swelled with rhythm and repetition, echoing the pulse of waves. The sea was no longer merely the path between lands, it was the measure of all things. In Lisbon, sailors returned with shells and sands from places unnamed, placing them before scholars who studied their colors like relics. In Venice, a young cartographer painted the Atlantic not as a void, but as a field of potential, dotted with islands that might or might not exist. "Here be dragons," he wrote, not as warning but invitation. The mood of Europe had changed. Fear had become fascination. The line between myth and map blurred into possibility. Even the language of ships transformed. To explore came to mean to unfold, as though the world were a manuscript written in water and wind. Each voyage was a turning of a page, each discovery a sentence in humanity's growing understanding of itself. Yet the sailors never forgot what the sea could do. For every fleet that returned triumphant, another vanished. The ocean remained impartial, generous, and cruel in equal measure. But to the men of this age, risk was the proof of worth. "We are born to follow the wind," wrote one Venetian captain, "and if it takes us beyond the world, so be it." The Renaissance had transformed faith into confidence. The sea had transformed fear into movement, and together they transformed mankind. By the century's end, Europe's harbors glowed with lanterns at night, each a star reflected in water. The sound of ropes and pulleys was the new heartbeat of civilization. Across every dock, words echoed in many tongues: Italian, Portuguese, Dutch, French, English, all speaking the same new dialect of ambition. The sails that rose against the dawn were no longer symbols of nations or faiths, but of an idea larger than either, that the world was meant to be known. And beyond the last horizon, unseen but certain, lay the next chapter, an ocean still without name, waiting for the ships that would soon find it. The Renaissance wind that began in the south did not stop at the Alps. It moved northward, colder and sharper, cutting through the gray skies of the North Sea and into the shipyards of Flanders, Holland, and England. There, amid rain and fog, a different kind of rebirth was taking shape, less gilded, more practical, but no less extraordinary. Where Venice gilded its galleys, the North painted its hulls with pitch. Where the Mediterranean mariners sailed for beauty, the Northerners sailed for survival. But the same spirit burned in both, the will to master the wind. The ports of the North looked nothing like those of the South. Gone were the marble quays and bell towers. Here, the harbors were framed by black timbers and iron cranes, the air thick with smoke from tar kilns. Gulls wheeled above brown water, heavy with tide. And yet, in the eyes of those who worked these docks, there shone the same brilliance that had lit the minds of the Italians. They simply expressed it differently, not through art, but through engineering. For the Northern Sea was a cruel teacher. Its waves were higher, its gales less forgiving, its winters long and merciless. To sail here was not to ornament the world, but to wrestle with it. Every ship was a fortress against the elements. Every voyage an argument with death. And yet, this very struggle gave the North its genius. In the shipyards of Amsterdam and Bristol, carpenters studied the southern carracks and caravels, then stripped away their decoration and rebuilt them for endurance. The northern hulls were thicker, their keels deeper, their masts broader to bear the heavy weather. They were ships born not of luxury, but of necessity, honest, strong, patient. The caravel of Portugal became the fluid of Holland, a vessel built purely for trade, high-sided, round-bellied, its decks clear for cargo, its rigging simple enough for a small crew. It was a merchant's dream, cheap to build, light to sail, and hard to sink. With it, the Dutch would one day weave an empire of commerce from the Baltic to the Indies. The English, watching closely, began to build their own designs, sleeker than the fluid, faster than the cog, armed with rows of small cannons. In the damp docks of Deptford and Portsmouth, Carpenters shaped oak into hulls that could both trade and fight. These ships would soon carry the ambitions of a kingdom still finding its sea legs, but for now, the sea remained the true monarch of the north. The wind ruled everything, the timing of trade, the rhythm of life. Entire towns rose and fell with the tide. In Amsterdam, the bells were tuned to it. In Bergen, the fishermen prayed by it. The wind could starve a nation or fill its coffers, and the men who understood it were treated with reverence. They were not knights or scholars, but pilots, masters of the compass and current. Their hands were cracked, their faces burned by salt, their speech thick with dialects that crossed nations. Yet they were the scientists of the storm, the philosophers of the horizon. They kept alive the knowledge the world was just beginning to rediscover, that motion itself was wisdom. The Northern Renaissance was not painted in color. It was carved in wood. In the Netherlands, shipwrights developed the first true slipways, long wooden ramps that allowed hulls to be built and launched more efficiently than ever before. With this came an explosion of productivity. Whole fleets could now rise within months instead of years. The North, once slow to change, became the workshop of the world. And with innovation came imagination. Cartographers in Bruges and London began to redraw the world's edges. Using reports from southern explorers, they combined fact and speculation into something new: possibility. The old dragons and sea monsters that once guarded the unknown faded, replaced by coastlines more exact, rivers traced in careful ink. The blank spaces of the world were shrinking. But the North was not content merely to copy. It had its own seas to conquer: the Atlantic swells, the Arctic ice, the fog-laden coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Its explorers were not driven by spices or gold, but by curiosity and necessity. The fish-rich waters of Iceland and Greenland drew fleets each spring, their sails bright against the gray horizon. The men who fished these edges of the world were half mariner, half myth, living on the line between endurance and extinction. In the taverns of Bristol, rumors began to spread of land even farther west, a shadow that appeared on the horizon during clear evenings, then vanished by dawn. Some said it was mirage. Others said it was memory, perhaps, of the Norse sagas that told of Vinland. But to the younger sailors, it was simply challenge. If land lies there, they said, we will find it. That hunger was the essence of the Northern Renaissance, not to gild what was known, but to prove what was guessed. While the Italians painted heavens and the Portuguese traced Africa, the Northerners looked toward the gray Atlantic and saw infinity. They built not cathedrals, but ships, not frescoes, but fleets. Their art was motion itself, the geometry of wind meeting wood. And in this quiet, determined work, they were preparing Europe for its greatest leap. The sea had made the North tough. Its people knew how to endure isolation, cold, and fear. They were patient as the tide, resilient as the oak they shaped. And when the time came to sail beyond maps, it would not be the merchants of Venice or the philosophers of Florence who led the way. It would be these men of fog and frost who had learned to read the wind by feel and steer by instinct alone. By the late 15th century, the North's harbors glowed with lantern light. The clang of hammers mixed with the cry of gulls and the chant of sailors hauling rope. The smell of tar and seawater filled the night air like incense. The world was waking again, this time not from faith, but from function. The Renaissance of sails had found its northern form. Austere, practical, endlessly driven, it spoke not of marble and melody, but of endurance and evolution. It was the poetry of the possible, written in the language of tide and timber. And beyond those damp and tireless docks, the Atlantic waited dark, patient, infinite for the ships that would soon dare to cross it. The 15th century's last winds blew colder, but they carried new voices, English, Dutch, and Danish, speaking the language of mastery. The Mediterranean still glittered, but its empires were fading into marble. The future now belonged to the gray waters of the North. In the ports of Amsterdam and London, invention had become an instinct. Men who once measured timber by eye now measured it by ratio. Mathematics, born in the universities of Italy, had found its true home in the shipyards of the north. The renaissance of sails had become a renaissance of precision. Each ship was a theorem tested by storm. Each voyage, a proof written in salt. The Dutch led the way in turning theory into trade. Their shipbuilders, descended from fishermen hardened by the North Sea, created vessels unlike any the world had known, efficient, sturdy, and humble. The Fluid, their masterpiece, was a revelation. A cargo ship so simple it could be sailed by a handful of men, so cheap it could be built in numbers. Its rounded belly held grain, cloth, and timber. Its narrow deck evaded the heavy tolls of southern ports. It was not beautiful, but it was perfect. Through the Fluid, the Dutch built a quiet empire. Their ships became as common on the horizon as clouds, linking Baltic pine to Mediterranean silk, English wool to Asian spice. They traded in everything: salt, herring, amber, and time itself. No cannon roared, no flags declared conquest. Yet, by the turn of the century, the Dutch had turned wind into wealth. England watched closely. Along the Thames, where shipyards sprawled like forests of masts, English carpenters learned from every design they could find: the Venetian galleys, the Portuguese caravel, the Hanseatic cog. They took what worked, discarded what didn't, and from this collage of genius forged something new: the English race, built galleon. It was long and lean, its sides sloped for speed, its deck bristling with small cannons. It was part merchant, part predator, born to hunt the horizon. Where the Fluid served peace, the galleon served ambition. Each one carried the hunger of a rising nation that had begun to dream beyond its island. England's sailors, half poets, half pirates, embodied that hunger. They spoke of freedom and profit with equal reverence, of God's favor and the thrill of the unknown. They were not content to trade. They wanted to test the edges of the earth. To do so, they needed more than courage. They needed knowledge. Navigation, once a mystery guarded by Mediterranean masters, now became an English obsession. Universities taught it. Guilds recorded it. The compass needle and the hourglass became symbols of progress. The stars themselves were charted in new atlases printed by northern presses, their names rendered not in Latin but in English and Dutch, the language of the working man. By starlight and ink, Europe's future was drawn. In London, the workshops of instrument makers glowed through the night. Brass quadrants, lead lines, and logboards filled the tables. Sailors came to learn how to read the invisible wind direction, current pull, magnetic deviation. The sea was no longer ruled by luck. It was ruled by mathematics. Even the ocean's mystery began to thin. The Atlantic, once a wall, became a field of study. Its tides were mapped, its tempests categorized. The same curiosity that painted heavens in Florence now measured horizons in Bristol. The Northern Renaissance had turned the artist's eye seaward. But this new mastery carried a shadow ambition sharpened into empire. Where the Venetians had sought beauty and the Portuguese discovery, the Northerners sought control. Wind and wood became instruments of power. The sea was not merely to be crossed, but claimed. In Amsterdam's counting houses, merchants spoke of the globe as if it were a ledger. Every voyage had columns: risk, cost, reward. The ocean's vastness became a market, its islands assets, its people commodities. It was the logical conclusion of the northern mind. If the sea could be measured, it could be owned. And yet, beneath that hard calculus, a quieter truth endured the same awe that had once filled the eyes of the Norse and the Venetians. Even the most practical captain, staring into the cold Atlantic dusk, felt small against the endlessness of water. The sea, though charted, remained sublime. The sailors of this age were haunted by both confidence and humility. They believed they could understand the world, but not tame it. Their ships were their prayers built by reason, carried by grace. From England's rocky cliffs, fleets began to venture farther than ever before. They rounded Ireland, tested the winds toward Iceland, and followed the currents toward the strange rumors whispered by fishermen of land beyond the western fog. Few returned, and fewer cared. The idea of what might lie beyond had become stronger than the fear of not returning. The Dutch, meanwhile, turned their gaze east. Their fleets cut around Africa toward the Indies, bringing back spices and silver, silk and porcelain. The same small, efficient ships that had conquered the Baltic now threaded through monsoons and typhoons. A northern empire had reached the equator. The sea had become global. Back home, the ports transformed into cities of glass and timber. Amsterdam's canals filled with masts like forests. London's docks stretched for miles, echoing with the cry of gulls and the clang of trade. Wealth poured in with each tide, wealth bought not with blood, but with wind. Still, the people of the north did not forget the price of that mastery. The storms reminded them. Every winter claimed its share of ships and souls. Every voyage bore risk enough to humble the proud. And so, even as they built empires, they built chapels beside shipyards, carving prayers into the beams. God guide our keels, the inscriptions read, and forgive our reach. By the end of the 15th century, the Renaissance was no longer just art or philosophy. It was motion. The sea, once a boundary, had become a road that circled the world. Every harbor hummed with purpose. Every sail was a promise. The North had found its rhythm, not the soft harmony of Venice, but the deep, steady drumbeat of waves against steel-gray coasts. It was the rhythm of endurance, precision, and resolve. And as the century waned, that rhythm grew louder. A new wind was rising from the west this time, carrying the smell of rain, salt, and destiny. Soon the northern sailors would follow it beyond the last known latitude, toward horizons no map yet claimed. The Renaissance had taught them how to build. The sea would now teach them how to believe again. The horizon had never looked so close. After centuries of superstition and sorrow, Europe stood ready to sail past its own imagination. By the late 15th century, the edges of maps no longer bore dragons or angels. They bore questions. The sea that had once confined humanity now beckoned it forward. And from the northern harbors, from Lisbon, Bristol, and St. Malo, the ships began to move. The world was trembling toward discovery. They sailed not as armies, nor as pilgrims, but as seekers' men chasing an idea that lay somewhere beyond the mist. Some sought trade routes, others redemption. Some only to prove that the earth curved gently instead of ending in a fall. But all of them shared the same hunger, to see what lay beyond the line where the sea met the sky. The Atlantic greeted them without welcome or warning. Its swells rose higher than any Mediterranean wave, its winds more savage, its depths unknown. The sailors called it the green wilderness. To them, it felt alive, breathing, whispering, sometimes screaming. It was a world without borders, and to sail it was to abandon certainty. The first voyages were half science, half prayer. The captains studied the compass as though it were an oracle. The sailors learned to trust the color of the clouds, the flight of seabirds, the scent of the wind. When the sun vanished behind storms, they turned to the stars, the same constellations that had guided Vikings and Crusaders, now newly named and mapped. Their decks were laboratories of courage. Each morning began in silence. The sea stretched in every direction, identical and infinite. To those who had grown up on crowded coasts, it felt like the face of eternity. Some wept from awe, others from terror. At night, when the waves glowed faintly with plankton fire, they whispered that they were sailing across the edge of the world's soul. The North Atlantic tested every invention of the Renaissance. The new compasses trembled with magnetic confusion. The hourglasses clogged with damp. Storms rolled out of nowhere, swallowing ships whole. One fleet vanished near the Azores. Another drifted for weeks with no wind. Trapped in a silence so total the men swore they could hear their own hearts stop. Yet still, they pressed on. They believed in the geometry of the globe, in the logic of the winds, in the promise of maps yet unwritten. They had learned too much to turn back. The horizon was no longer a mystery, it was a destination. In Lisbon, King João's court filled with rumors. Fishermen brought word of driftwood carved by unknown hands, of bodies washed ashore with dark skin and strange ornaments. To the scholars, these were signs of another world. To the sailors, they were invitations. Portugal's princes dreamed of reaching India by circling Africa, but others, restless English and Breton captains, imagined something more radical, that the world's riches might lie not east, but west. To sail westward was madness. To succeed would be immortality. They began to gather in the harbors, these men of impossible hope. Some had fought in wars, some fled the plague, others were sons of fishermen who could not bear to live and die within sight of the same shore. Their ships were small caravels, no longer than 50 feet, yet within them burned the same fire that once built cathedrals. Each departure was an act of faith disguised as mathematics. The priests blessed the voyages, sprinkling salt water like holy oil. Mothers clung to sons, wives whispered into sleeves, children watched the sails vanish into the fog. The sound of oars faded first, then the bells, until nothing remained but the wind. Weeks passed. The sea grew emptier, the air heavier. The compass pointed nowhere. Some men swore the stars shifted, that God had rearranged the heavens to mock them. The water grew warm, the color of copper. Food spoiled, tempers frayed. When one man claimed to see a ghost ship drifting beside them, the others didn't laugh, they saluted. Still, the captains kept their course. To turn back was death of another kind, the death of wonder. The sea rewarded persistence with revelation. One dawn, a sailor sighted something impossible, a flock of birds flying west. "Land," he whispered. The words spread across the deck like fire. They followed the birds for days, hearts pounding, until the horizon broke not with cliffs or cities, but with clouds shaped like mountains. They had not reached land, but they had reached belief. That was enough. When the first of these westward voyages limped home, half their crews lost, their sails in tatters. The survivors spoke of things no scholar could verify: islands of golden sand, forests taller than cathedrals, sunsets that lasted forever. Many doubted them, but doubt was no longer strong enough to stop the tide. The idea had escaped the harbor. Europe, once hemmed in by its own fear, began to tilt toward the unknown. The universities debated new maps. The merchants drew up contracts. Kings dreamed of empires that spanned oceans instead of rivers. The seas that had once divided civilizations were about to unite them. But in the quiet between storms, the sailors themselves felt something deeper than ambition. Alone on decks beneath stars untouched by scripture, they sensed the truth their world had almost forgotten, that discovery was not conquest, but communion. To sail beyond the known world was not to flee God, but to find him in motion. The wind no longer sounded like command. It sounded like invitation. And though they did not yet know it, those first westward voyagers had already changed everything. The world shape was shifting not on maps, but in minds. The earth was no longer the center of creation, but a part of something larger, curved, and endless. It would take generations to measure that curve. But in the stillness before dawn, as one ship cut through green water under a sky full of unrecorded stars, mankind had already crossed the true boundary, not the edge of the world, but the edge of its own fear. The ocean had no borders, but the men who sailed it soon found their limits. Weeks turned into months. The food grew foul, the water brackish. The sails sagged from salt and Sunday, yet still the ships pressed west, their timbers groaning like old prayers. Every creak became a heartbeat, every gust of wind a whisper that said further. In the logbooks, the captain stopped writing of distance and began writing of faith. "We sail," one recorded, "beyond the comfort of the known, trusting that the earth bends back to meet itself." He wrote the words by lantern light, his ink diluted by seawater, his hands shaking from hunger. The sea was teaching them humility, lesson by lesson, wave by wave. Storms came without warning. Black walls of water rose out of the dusk, swallowing horizon and sky alike. The men lashed themselves to the masts, shouting psalms into the roar. Lightning split the heavens. Thunder rolled like the anger of forgotten gods. When morning returned, the sea was flat again. as if nothing had happened. The survivors stared into the calm and wondered if they'd dreamt the violence. For every ship that reached new waters, another disappeared, vanishing into mist or silence. The ocean gave no graves, only memory. But the sailors who lived became legend. Their tales, told in taverns from Bristol to Lisbon, blurred fact with wonder. Seas that boiled, islands that sang, creatures half man and half wave. Scholars dismissed them as superstition, yet mapmakers quietly left space for them on their charts. Because something was out there, something vast, unseen, undeniable. Each westward journey added proof. Driftwood carved by strange tools, unfamiliar birds, the color of silt in the waves. The world, it seemed, was wider and richer than any scripture had dared to say. To the sailors, that realization felt holy. They began to see divinity not in the cathedrals of stone they had left behind, but in the endless horizon that demanded faith without promise. The ocean became a living altar. The compass rose replaced the cross. The wind became a psalm. One night, when the stars burned bright enough to cast shadows on deck, the helmsman of a small caravel wrote in his journal, "We are the first men to be truly alive, for we have no walls between us and creation." And he did not know that centuries later, philosophers would echo his words in libraries built on the gold and pain these voyages would unleash. For now, there was only the silence of discovery. When they finally reached land, small, green, and unknown, they did not cheer. They fell to their knees. The trees towered above them. The birds cried in strange voices. The air smelled of fruit and thunder. The world they had found was not the edge, but another beginning. Their maps had been wrong in every direction, and that was the miracle. They planted flags in the sand, though they did not yet know whose world they were claiming. To the sailors, it was enough that they had survived the crossing. To their patrons back home, it meant wealth beyond imagining. To history, it meant the world had doubled. But the sea, impartial as ever, cared little for what men named or claimed. It would take back its due. The return journeys were worse. Winds turned traitorous. Storms struck without pattern. Half the ships that found new lands never saw home again. Their names became prayers whispered by widows and children, carried on the same wind that had carried them away. Yet the survivors came back changed, not richer, but wiser. Their faces were leathered by salt, their eyes distant. When they spoke, their words carried the weight of truth. The world, they said, is endless, and we have touched only its skin. Europe listened and trembled. The church hesitated. Kings schemed. Merchants salivated. The promise of discovery was intoxicating. Fleets were commissioned. Treaties drafted. Fortunes gambled. The Atlantic became the new frontier of faith and greed alike. The sailors themselves did not see empires or colonies, only horizons. They were not saints or villains, but witnesses. The ocean had shown them both the glory and terror of creation, and they could never unsee it. In their silence lay the birth of modern awe. Some of them spoke of a feeling that came just before dawn, when the water turned silver and the world seemed suspended between dream and waking. In that hour, they said, you could sense the curve of the earth, the weight of all that remained unseen. It feels, one wrote, as though the sea is thinking of us. They did not realize that humanity was learning to think like the sea, vast, restless, infinite. From their discoveries would come maps, and from maps, empires. But for that brief, luminous moment, before conquest corrupted curiosity, they had been pure explorers, pilgrims of wonder. Their courage bridged an age. The Middle Ages had ended not in fire or plague, but in sailcloth and starlight. The world was no longer bounded by walls of fear, but by the reach of wind and will. Back in the northern ports, as winter settled over the harbors, the shipyards glowed through the fog. Carpenters built faster now. Investors clamored for shares. The age of isolated kingdoms was ending. The age of oceans had begun. But in the taverns, where the real history of the sea was told, the old sailors said it more simply. The earth is round, they'd whisper, and the heart is round with it. They would raise their cups to those lost, to those yet to sail, and the firelight would flicker like sunlight on water. Outside, the tide would rise. It always did, and far beyond the reach of any empire, under the same stars that had guided them, the sea breathed eternal, infinite, waiting for the next generation to chase its edge. The sea remembers everything. It remembers the whisper of the first oar dipping into the surf, the crack of Viking longships striking foreign sands, the chants of crusader fleets bound east, the cries of merchants and the silence of plague ships. It remembers because it never changes. The waves that touched the hulls of those who conquered and perished still break on our shores today, tireless and eternal. For 1,000 years, humanity had chased its reflection across that shifting mirror. Every era had left a ripple, some bright, some dark, but all moving in the same direction, outward, from the fjords of the north to the sunlit harbors of the Mediterranean, from the salt-stung docks of England to the marble quays of Venice. One truth had endured. The sea was both adversary and ally, mirror and muse. Now, at the dawn of a new world, that truth glimmered brighter than ever. The men who returned from the edge of the world came home to a Europe unrecognizable. Their discoveries had torn the veil from creation. The old maps looked like lies. The old boundaries of nations, of knowledge, of faith no longer held. The tide of history had turned, and it could not be stopped. Empires rose overnight. The Atlantic, once the graveyard of myths, became the artery of commerce. Gold and silver crossed it in one direction, faith, steel, and ambition in the other. The same wind that carried discovery now carried domination. But beneath conquest's shadow, the spirit of wonder endured a quieter current, running beneath the noise of empire, because the sailors themselves had changed forever. They had looked upon the curve of the earth and seen how small they were. They had watched the horizon burn with dawns no king could command. They had faced the endlessness and lived. When they told their stories in ports, in palaces, in the corners of smoky taverns, they spoke not of glory, but of the feeling that had haunted them most. The stillness before the storm, the way the world seemed to breathe with them when the sails were full. The sea, one old pilot whispered before his death, does not belong to us. We belong to it. That was the true legacy of the tide. It had taught mankind humility through hardship, patience through failure, and courage through fear. Every plank laid, every compass turned, every sail raised, had been an act of faith not in gods, but in the human spirit itself. The ship was our greatest creation, not because it conquered the sea, but because it united us with it. It was made of the same elements we feared: wood from storm, torn forests, iron from the earth's core, cloth woven from plants that swayed in the wind. When we built ships, we built extensions of ourselves, fragile, flawed, yet infinitely determined. In every voyage, there was a whisper of the first explorer who dared to leave the shore. In every modern harbor, a shadow of the Viking longship, its prow cutting through fog like a prayer. The designs had changed, the materials refined, but the purpose remained the same: to chase the unknown and call it home. The Renaissance had turned that impulse into art. The age of discovery had turned it into empire. But beneath every flag and profit ledger, the same pulse beat: curiosity. The sea did not make men rich. It made them aware. Aware of the vastness, of their smallness, of the fragile miracle that life persisted upon the edge of chaos. Nowhere was that awareness clearer than in the new maps. The parchment world, once filled with guesses and monsters, had been transformed into elegant geometry, coasts inked in careful lines, winds marked by arrows, currents by curling strokes of blue. Yet for all their precision, the mapmakers never stopped leaving space at the edges, those pale, open margins where imagination still roamed. It was as if they knew that even in knowledge, mystery must remain. The sailors who had once braved the Atlantic now trained their sons to read instruments instead of stars, but their songs did not change. Around fires and in the belly of ships, they still sang of the sea as if it were alive. Their voices carried the same rhythm as the tide rise, fall, return. Every generation inherits that rhythm. Even now, in the hum of engines and the steel of modern ships, we can still hear it, the heartbeat of history beneath the waves. The same ocean that had swallowed empires still calls to us to explore, to endure, to understand. And though we no longer sail to the edge of the world, we sail to the edges of ourselves. Because the legacy of the tide is not written in maps or monuments. It is written in motion, in the eternal act of leaving shore, in the courage to face the unknown. Every voyage, no matter how small, carries that inheritance. Every traveler who watches the horizon feels it, that ancient ache to move, to see, to know. The sea remains our oldest teacher. It humbles kings, strengthens the weak, and forgives no arrogance. It has drowned armies and delivered saints. It asks for nothing but respect, and gives everything in return: wonder, wisdom, and the quiet knowledge that nothing in this world truly ends. For even when the ships rot, even when the empires fade, the tide remains. It pulls at our shores, our hearts, our history. It whispers the same truth it has whispered since the first sail caught wind. Go, there is always further. And so we go. Even now, if you stand by the shore at dusk, you can hear it, the same murmur that guided the Vikings through the fog, that whispered to Venetian traders beneath their gilded lanterns, that roared against the prows of ships bound for the edge of the world. It is the voice of the tide, speaking in the oldest language known to man, the sound of return. The sea does not forget. It carries every sound it has ever heard: the hammer of shipwrights, the shouts of oarsmen, the weeping of widows, the laughter of sailors seeing home again. Beneath the waves, history sleeps unbroken. Bronze anchors, wooden ribs, bones of explorers and emperors alike, all rest in the same silence. The tide passes over them without judgment. For all our progress, we are still its students. The men who once measured the world by sailcloth would not recognize our age of steel and satellite. Yet they would understand our longing. The hunger that drove them west still burns in us, a quiet insistence that there is always something more beyond the horizon. The form of the voyage changes. The reason never does. The Renaissance gave us tools to see the world. The sea taught us what to do with that sight. It showed us that beauty and danger are one, that courage and fear share a border as thin as a cresting wave. And though the age of wooden ships has passed, its spirit endures in every motion that seeks discovery, in the scientist mapping galaxies, in the diver descending into darkness, in the dreamer standing on a cliff watching the sunset slip beneath the sea. All of them answer the same call. That call has echoed for 1,000 years. It began in the north, where longships sliced through mist. It grew louder in the south, where galleys glided across sapphire waters. It thundered through the Renaissance, when caravels and carracks carried mankind past its own imagination. And it still hums in the engines of modern ships that cross the same oceans, tracing the same routes written by stars. Every harbor, every coast, every lighthouse is a page in the same unending story, a story written by the wind, edited by the tide, signed by the hands of those who dared to leave. But legacies are fragile things. They survive only if remembered. And so we tell these stories not to glorify conquest or mourn loss, but to honor the endurance of the human heart. Because that is what the sea reveals most clearly: endurance. Empires rise and collapse. Faiths change, languages fade, maps are redrawn. Yet the tide returns, faithful and relentless. It is the heartbeat beneath history. Every generation hears it differently, but it always says the same thing: move forward. In that rhythm, there is comfort. It tells us that nothing truly ends. The same current that once carried Viking raiders now carries fishermen, travelers, and explorers of the digital world. The same wind that filled the sails of carracks now fills turbines, turning that wind into light. Progress, like tide, is circular. What was lost becomes new again. And if we listen closely, the sea still speaks the language of those who came before. It speaks of courage born from ignorance, of men who believed the horizon was a wall and sailed through it anyway, of women who waited at the windows of stone cities, watching the sails disappear and whispering prayers to indifferent waves, of generations who built, rebuilt, and built again after every storm. They gave us more than trade routes and maps. They gave us proof that humanity could rise from its own fear, that motion itself could be meaning. Today, their descendants walk the same shores and look out at the same gray-green water. The ships are different, the sails replaced by steel, but the silence before departure remains the same tension between fear and faith, the same question whispered against the wind, what waits beyond? The answer is still the same. Go and see. Because the legacy of the tide is not found in the past, it lives in the act of going. It lives in every journey, in every dream that dares to leave the safety of land. When you stand at the edge of the sea and watch the horizon fade into gold, you are standing in the footprints of 1,000 generations. The wind on your face is the same wind that filled the sails of longships and caravels. The sound you hear in your chest, that ache of distance, that pull towards something greater, is the same pulse that drove them all. They listened to it. They trusted it. And the world grew because of them. The sea never asked for worship, only remembrance. And we remember best when we keep moving, when we honor their courage not with monuments of stone, but with our own small acts of discovery. When we build, when we explore, when we refuse to let fear anchor us. For the tide never rests. It only waits. And now, as the last light fades across the water, the same whisper returns soft as breath, strong as faith. Before the compass, before the empire, there were sails and the will to chase the edge of the world. That will still lives in you. So if their voyages moved you, if their courage stirred something deep beneath your own horizon, let it continue. Share it. Carry it forward. Keep the story alive, because the sea is still calling, and every like, every share, every voice that joins the song is another sail rising against the endless sky. May their legacy fill your heart like wind fills canvas. May you always hear the tide. And when it calls, as it always does, may you answer, as they did, with courage, with wonder, with motion. For the story of the sea never ends. It only begins again every time someone dares to look toward the horizon. And so the tide turns again. The sails of centuries fall silent, but their echoes remain in every wave that meets the shore, in every wind that still carries the scent of distant worlds. The story of the sea was never about ships alone. It was about us, about how far we dared to go when fear told us to stay. From the longships of the north to the galleys of the south, from the plague-haunted ports to the shining age of discovery, every voyage began with a single decision: to move forward. And that decision made us who we are. The ocean remembers every soul that ever trusted it. It remembers the courage of those who left and the silence of those who waited. It remembers the songs of sailors who vanished beyond the horizon, and it carries them still in the rhythm of the waves that break upon our world. If their sails once moved your imagination, if their courage stirred something deep within you, then let that spirit continue to move not only across time, but across hearts. Because stories like theirs survive only when they are carried by voices, by memory, by those willing to share them. So if this journey through 1,000 years of tide spoke to you, if you could hear the wind in their sails, feel the salt upon your skin, see the light of forgotten horizons, then don't let their legacy fade. Keep their voyage alive. Share it. Pass it forward. Let others hear the sea call their name as it once called yours. Like their courage, your voice matters, your click, your share. Your presence keeps history breathing. The tide of memory moves because of those who join it. So like for the builders, the dreamers, the wanderers who refuse to be still, share for the generations who followed the wind and found the world, and subscribe to sail with us again into the next untold chapter of our shared past. For the ocean has more stories to tell, And as long as there are hearts that listen, it will never fall silent. From the mists of the north to the golden seas of the south, from the first oar to the final sail, their journey continues through you. This is cinematic history, and the tide, like memory, never ends.